Hey there. Couldn't sleep? It's okay, you're in the right place, just a small favor. Did you know 89% watch without subscribing? If you enjoy this, I'd really appreciate your support. And let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what time is it? Thanks for being here. They say the land remembers everything. Every footstep, every scream, every drop of blood that has ever touched the earth becomes part of its memory. In the vast wilderness of the Four Corners country, where Utah territory bleeds into Arizona and Colorado, the land remembers things that should have been forgotten long ago. I learned this truth during my 15 years as a park ranger, but it wasn't until that autumn in the 9 Mile Valley that I understood what the land was trying to tell me. The whispers in the wind, the shadows that moved wrong, the way certain areas fell silent when you approached them. These weren't just my imagination playing tricks after too many lonely nights in the wilderness. The ancient petroglyphs scattered throughout Monument Valley and the sacred sites near the Navajo Nation tried to warn us. The elders at the Apache reservation spoke in hushed tones about things that walked the earth before man, things that learned to wear our faces when the need arose. But we rangers, with our modern equipment and rational minds, dismissed such stories as folklore, until the night I encountered what the locals had been calling the skin mutant, though that clinical term fails to capture the true horror of what I witnessed. Some experiences carve themselves so deeply into your soul that they become part of who you are, like scar tissue that never quite heals. This is the story of how I learned that some legends are not legends at all, but warnings from those wise, enough to fear what lurks in the spaces between civilization and wilderness. What follows is my account of those 3 days in October, when the boundary between our world and something far more ancient and malevolent grew thin enough for something to cross over. I've changed some names to protect the innocent, but every word of what I'm about to tell you is true. I stake my reputation, my sanity, and my life on that claim. You learn to read the forest like a book when you've spent as much time in it as I have. Every ranger worth their salt knows that the wilderness speaks to those who listen carefully. Enough. The way birds fall silent before a storm, how animals alter their patterns when predators move through their territory, the subtle shifts in wind patterns that signal weather changes hours before they arrive. These are the vocabulary of survival in places where cell phones don't work and the nearest hospital is 100 miles away. But there are other signs, darker ones that most rangers prefer not to discuss during our monthly meetings in Sedona. Signs that suggest the forest holds secrets older and more dangerous than any bear or mountain lion. I first learned about these signs from Vincent Harrison, a grizzled veteran ranger who'd worked the Four Corners region for 37 years before retiring to a small cabin near Walker Lake. "Bennett," Vincent told me during my second week on the job, his weathered face serious in the flickering light of our campfire. "There are places in this wilderness where the rules change. Areas where compasses spin wildly, where your radio picks up voices speaking languages that died out centuries ago, where you find footprints that belong to no animal in any field guide." I was young then, fresh out of ranger training, full of scientific explanations for every mystery. "Come on, Vincent," I laughed, poking at the fire with a stick. "You sound like those tourists who come looking for UFOs and ancient aliens." Vincent didn't smile. "I've seen things, son. Things that made me question everything I thought I knew about this world. Promise me something. When you encounter your first unexplained phenomenon, and you will, don't dismiss it as imagination. The forest has been here long before us, and it will be here long after we're gone. Respect that, and you might just survive your career with your sanity intact." 3 months later, I found my first impossible footprint. It was during a routine patrol near the southern edge of my assigned territory, a remote section of wilderness that bordered some of the most sacred sites of the Navajo Nation. I was investigating reports of illegal camping when I came across a clearing where the grass had been trampled in perfect circles, as if something had been dancing or performing some kind of ritual. In the center of the largest circle, pressed deep into the mud beside a small stream, was a footprint unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was roughly human in size and shape, but wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. The toes were too long, ending in what appeared to be claw marks. The arch was too high, almost as if whatever had made it walked on the balls of its feet like an animal. But most disturbing of all were the additional marks around the edges, small finger-like impressions that suggested this thing had other appendages, extra digits that had no place on any creature I could identify. I photographed the print from every angle, measured it carefully, and made detailed notes in my logbook. But when I returned to the station that evening and developed the photos, they showed nothing but empty mud. The measurements I'd recorded made no sense when I reviewed them, dimensions that shifted and contradicted themselves as if I'd been drunk or suffering from heat stroke when I wrote them. That night, I called Vincent. "You found your first sign," he said simply, no surprise in his voice. "What are you going to do about it?" "I don't know what I found," I admitted. "The evidence doesn't make sense. The photos came out blank and my notes are gibberish." "The forest protects its secrets," Vincent explained, "but it also warns those who are meant to receive the warning. You saw that footprint for a reason, Bennett. The question is, are you going to listen to what it's trying to tell you?" Over the following months, I encountered more signs. Trees twisted into impossible shapes overnight. Animals behaving in ways that defied their natural instincts. Deer standing in perfect geometric patterns. Birds flying in formations that hurt to look at directly. Small mammals gathering in large groups and remaining motionless for hours at a time, as if waiting for some signal only they could perceive. But it was Silas Damien, a Navajo guide who sometimes worked with our ranger station, who finally gave me the words to describe what I was experiencing. "You're seeing the preparations," Silas told me as we sat in his truck during a joint search and rescue operation. We were looking for a missing hiker named Chase Kingston, a freelance photographer who'd been documenting petroglyphs in the area before disappearing 3 days earlier. My grandmother's grandmother used to tell stories about times when the barriers between worlds grow thin. When that happens, things that normally stay hidden begin to prepare for emergence. "Prepare for what?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. "To cross over," Silas said quietly, "to take what they need from our world and make it their own." We found Chase Kingston that afternoon, or what remained of him. He was hanging from a tree branch 15 feet off the ground, his body positioned in a way that suggested he'd been placed there rather than climbed up and fallen. His camera was missing, but his notebook was still in his backpack. The final entry, written in a shaky hand that grew increasingly erratic with each line, described something he'd seen near the old petroglyph site. Day 3. Something wrong with the carvings. They're moving when I'm not looking directly at them. The symbols are rearranging themselves into new patterns. And there's something else here. Something watching me from the tree line. It looks almost human from a distance, but when it moves, God help me, when it moves, I can see that its skin doesn't fit right. Like it's wearing someone else's body, like an ill-fitting suit. I think it wants my camera. I think it wants to know what I've seen. I'm going to try to get closer. Get a better photo. This could be the discovery of a lifetime. The notebook entry stopped there. The official report listed Chase's death as accidental, the result of a fall while attempting to photograph wildlife in a tree. But I knew better. I'd seen the marks on his body, puncture wounds too large and too deep to have been caused by branches, and scratches that formed patterns too deliberate to be random. That night I dreamed of footprints in the mud. But this time they weren't empty. This time, they were following me. Fall arrived early that year, bringing with it an unseasonable cold snap that sent most of the local wildlife into hibernation weeks ahead of schedule. The forest grew eerily quiet, as if every living thing had collectively decided to hold its breath and wait for something to pass. Tourist activity dropped to nearly nothing, leaving me alone with my patrols and my growing sense that something fundamental was about to change. It was during this period of unnatural stillness that I received the call that would change my life. Forever. "Bennett," came the crackling voice over my radio. It was Cole Zachary, another ranger who worked the northern sector. "I need backup at the old Nathaniel Creek campground. We've got a situation here." "What kind of situation?" I asked, already reaching for my keys. "I'm not sure how to describe it," Cole said, his voice tight with fear. "Just get here as fast as you can. And Bennett, bring extra ammunition. The drive. to Nathaniel Creek took 45 minutes on winding dirt roads that seemed to grow narrower and more treacherous with each passing mile. As I approached the campground, I noticed that the usual sounds of the forest had been replaced by a complete, oppressive silence. Even my truck engine seemed muted, as if the air itself was absorbing sound. I found Cole standing beside his patrol vehicle, a rifle cradled in his arms, his eyes fixed on something in the tree line that I couldn't see. His face was pale and his hands shook slightly as he gestured for me to approach quietly. "It's been watching me for the past hour," he whispered when I got close enough. "Every time I move, it moves. Every time I stop, it stops. But Bennett, the way it moves, it's not right. It's like it's learning how to walk while it watches me." I followed his gaze into the shadows between the trees, squinting to make out whatever had spooked him so badly. At first, I saw nothing but the usual interplay of light and shadow that makes wilderness areas so disorienting. Then, gradually, a shape began to emerge from the darkness. A tall, roughly human figure standing motionless behind a cluster of pine trees about 50 yards away. "How long has it been there?" I asked, my hand moving instinctively to my own weapon. "Since about noon," Cole replied. "I was doing a routine check of the campsites when I saw it. At first I thought it was just another hiker who'd wandered off the marked trails, but when I called out to it, it didn't respond. It just stood there, watching. And then I realized." "Realized what?" Cole's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "It doesn't have a face." I looked more carefully and felt a chill run down my spine. He was right. Where a face should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin stretched tight over what might have been bone. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a blank expanse of flesh that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "We need to call this in," I said, reaching for my radio. "I tried," Cole said. "Radio's been dead since I got here. Yours too, I'd bet." He was right. My radio produced nothing but static, and my cell phone showed no signal. We were completely cut off from outside help. As we watched, the thing in the trees began to move. But move was the wrong word for what we witnessed. It flowed between the shadows like liquid, its form shifting and undulating in ways that defied basic anatomy. One moment, it appeared tall and thin, the next short and stocky. Its limbs seemed to stretch and contract independently of each other, and its head swiveled in directions that would have snapped a human neck. "We should leave," I said, backing toward my truck. "Whatever that thing is, we're not equipped to handle it," but Cole grabbed my arm. "Look at it, Bennett, really look at it." "What do you see?" I forced myself to focus on the creature, and slowly began to notice details that made my blood run cold. Its skin wasn't quite skin at all. It was more like a membrane, translucent in places, revealing dark shapes moving underneath. And those shapes. They looked almost like organs, but arranged in configurations that made no biological sense. "It's wearing something," I whispered, understanding dawning on me like a sick revelation. "That's not its real body." The thing seemed to sense our scrutiny, because it suddenly stopped moving and turned what passed for its head in our direction. Even without visible eyes, I could feel its attention on us like a physical weight. Then, slowly, it began to approach. Its gait was unlike anything I'd ever seen. A strange, rolling motion that suggested its legs were jointed in places where human legs had no joints. With each step, its body seemed to ripple and adjust as if whatever was inside the skin suit was constantly readjusting its position to maintain the illusion of human movement. "Run," I said. We ran. The thing followed us, not in the way a human pursues someone, with purpose and determination, but like a predator that has all the time in the world to track its prey. As Cole and I raced through the forest in my truck, headlights cutting through the rapidly deepening twilight, I caught glimpses of it in my rearview mirror. It moved through the trees with fluid grace, sometimes running on two legs, sometimes dropping to all fours and loping like a wolf, always maintaining the same distance behind us. "What the hell is that thing?" Cole gasped, clutching the dashboard as we bounced over a particularly rough section of road. "I don't know," I admitted, though Vincent's warnings echoed in my mind. but I think I know someone who might. We drove hard for 20 minutes, putting as much distance as possible between ourselves and whatever was hunting us. When we finally reached the main road, I expected to see the creature fade back into the wilderness, defeated by civilization and bright lights. Instead, it emerged from the tree line and stood at the edge of the pavement, its featureless face turned in our direction as we sped away. In the harsh glare of a streetlight, I got my clearest look at it yet. The skin that covered its body was mottled and pale, hanging loose in some places and stretched tight in others. Dark veins or vessels were visible beneath the surface, pulsing with a rhythm that didn't match any heartbeat I knew. Most disturbing of all, the skin appeared to be healing itself where it had been torn by branches and thorns, the wounds closing like liquid mercury flowing back together. I drove straight to Vincent's cabin near Walker Lake, pushing my truck harder than I'd ever pushed it before. Vincent met us at his door, one look at our faces telling him everything he needed to know. "You saw one," he said simply. "Vincent, what are those things?" He gestured for us to come inside, then carefully locked the door behind us and checked the windows before speaking. "The elders at the Apache reservation have a name for them," he said finally. "They call them skin thieves. According to the old stories, they're what's left of people who tried to become something they weren't meant to be." Cole looked skeptical. "You're talking about shapeshifters? Like werewolves?" "Not shapeshifters," Vincent corrected. "Something worse. The legends say they were once human, but they made a bargain with forces older than our understanding. They gave up their own flesh in exchange for the ability to wear the flesh of others. But the process is imperfect. The skin never fits quite right, and over time it begins to rot and fall apart. So they hunt for fresh replacements." I thought about the way the creature had moved, the rippling adjustments beneath its stolen skin. How do we stop it? Vincent's expression grew grave. "The traditional methods don't work against these things. Bullets might slow them down, but they won't kill them. Fire works better, but you have to burn the entire body, including whatever's underneath the skin. And you have to be fast. They're stronger and faster than they appear, and they're intelligent. They learn from every encounter." As if summoned by our conversation, something scraped against the cabin's exterior wall. We all froze, listening to the sound of something large circling the building. Vincent reached for a shotgun mounted above the fireplace and motioned for us to stay quiet. The scraping stopped, replaced by a new sound, a wet sliding noise like raw meat being dragged across rough wood. It was moving up the side of the cabin, defying gravity in its pursuit of some unknown goal. Then came the knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the roof directly above our heads. A pause. 3 more knocks, this time slightly to the left. Another pause, then 3 knocks to the right. It was testing the roof, searching for weak points or ways inside. "The attic," Vincent whispered, pointing to a trapdoor in the ceiling. "It's trying to find a way in through there." The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. We waited, barely breathing, for several long minutes. Then Vincent's landline telephone rang, the shrill sound making all 3 of us jump. Vincent looked at the phone in confusion. "Nobody has this number except for emergency services," he said. "And the nearest relay tower is 40 miles from here." The phone continued ringing. After 10 rings, Vincent slowly reached for it. "Hello?" I watched his face go white as he listened to whatever was on the other end. After a long moment, he hung up without saying a word. "What was it?" Cole asked. "A voice," Vincent said slowly, but not quite right, like someone was trying to remember how human speech works. It knew my name. It knew all of our names. The implications of this hit me like a physical blow. It's been listening to us, learning from us. Before anyone could respond, we heard the sound of my truck starting outside. We rushed to the window and saw the creature behind the wheel, its stolen skin stretched and distorted as it manipulated controls designed for human hands. The headlights swept across the cabin as it backed out of the driveway, and in that brief moment of illumination, I saw its face clearly for the first time. It wasn't featureless after all. It had constructed crude approximations of human features using whatever materials it could find. Small stones for eyes, torn strips of bark for a mouth, pine needles arranged in patterns that suggested eyebrows and wrinkles. The overall effect was like looking at a child's drawing of a person come to horrible life. "It's adapting," Vincent said grimly. Learning to mimic us more effectively, the truck disappeared into the darkness, leaving us stranded at Vincent's cabin with only the forest and our fears for company. Vincent began pulling supplies from various hiding places around the room. Flare guns, emergency radios, bottles of what looks in the deepest parts of America's wilderness, where ancient trees whisper secrets older than civilization, and shadows move with purpose, some things should never be disturbed. Some boundaries should never be crossed, and some hungers should never be fed. What follows is my account of 7 days that changed everything I thought I knew about the natural world, and about the predators that hunt within it. The radio crackled to life at 3:47 a.m., jolting me from the restless sleep that had become my norm since transferring to this remote station in the Kaibab National Forest. Static filled my small cabin before Bennett's voice cut through, strained and urgent. "Base, this is Ranger Bennett. I need backup at coordinates 36.8619, 112.1401. Found something. Christ, I don't even know how to describe this." I fumbled for the radio in the darkness, my training kicking in despite the fog of interrupted sleep. "Bennett, this is base station. What's your situation? Are you injured?" Long seconds of static followed. When Bennett's voice returned, it carried a tremor I'd never heard from the veteran ranger in our 3 years working together. "No injuries, but there's a body here. At least, I think it's a body. It's like someone turned a person inside out and then tried to put them back together wrong." The coffee I'd been nursing since midnight suddenly tasted like ash. I'd seen plenty of animal attacks during my 15 years as a park ranger, from bear maulings in Montana to mountain lion incidents in Colorado, but something in Bennett's voice suggested this was different. "Stay put, Bennett. Don't touch anything. I'm en route." I dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, checking my gear with practiced efficiency. Flashlight, first aid kit, radio, sidearm, though what good a 45 would do against whatever had done this to another human being I couldn't imagine. The forest outside my cabin window looked different somehow in the pale starlight, as if the familiar pines and aspens had rearranged themselves while I slept. The drive to Bennett's coordinates took 45 minutes on winding forest service, roads that seemed to grow narrower and more overgrown with each passing mile. By the time I reached the location, dawn was beginning to bleed through the canopy, casting everything in a sickly yellow-green light that made even the healthiest trees look diseased. I found Bennett standing beside his patrol vehicle, smoking a cigarette with hands that shook despite the warm June morning. He'd been a ranger for over 2 decades, had pulled bodies from rivers and avalanche sites, had faced down aggressive wildlife without flinching. Seeing him reduced to this hollow-eyed wreck sent ice through my veins. "Where is it?" I asked, checking that my radio was set to the emergency channel. Bennett pointed with his cigarette toward a small clearing maybe 30 yards into the tree line. "Right through there." But nothing could have prepared me for what's in those woods. I followed his directions, pushing through dense undergrowth that seemed to resist my passage. The forest felt wrong here, too quiet except for an occasional sound that might have been wind in the branches or might have been something else entirely. When I reached the clearing, I understood why Bennett had been reduced to a nervous wreck. The body, if it could still be called that, lay sprawled in the center of the open space like some nightmarish scarecrow. At first glance, it appeared human. But as I moved closer, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to turn and run, the wrongness became apparent. The skin hung loose and ill-fitting, as if it had been removed and then hastily reapplied by someone who had never seen a human body before. Limbs were too long in some places, too short in others. The face was a grotesque parody of human features, with eyes set too far apart and a mouth that stretched nearly from ear to ear. But it was the smell that nearly sent me to my knees, a combination of decay and something else, something alive, and hungry and utterly alien. I managed to key my radio without taking my eyes off the thing in the clearing, "Bennett, we need to contact the county sheriff immediately and tell them to bring their forensics team." "Already tried," came his reply. "Radio won't reach that far from this location. It's like something's interfering with the signal." I tried. My own radio cycling through channels. Nothing but static and an occasional sound that might have been breathing. The forest around the clearing seemed to pulse with malevolent life, shadows shifting despite the steady morning light. That's when I noticed the tracks. They led away from the body in a roughly westward direction, but they weren't like any animal prints I'd ever encountered in my years of wilderness training. They were human-sized but wrong, with too many toes and claw marks that dug deep into the soft earth. More disturbing still, they seemed to change as they progressed, becoming less human and more something else with each step. I photographed everything with the digital camera from my pack, though the images seemed to blur strangely when I reviewed them. The body, the tracks, the clearing itself. Nothing would focus properly, as if the camera was having trouble deciding what it was actually seeing. By the time I made it back to Bennett, he'd finished his cigarette and started on another. His face was pale beneath his summer tan, and his usually steady hands continued their nervous trembling. "Did you see them?" he asked without looking at me. "See what?" "The tracks. They're everywhere once you know how to look." He gestured vaguely at the ground around his feet. "Started seeing them about a week ago. Thought maybe it was just unusual wildlife, maybe something driven down from higher elevations by the drought. But then I found that thing in there." I looked where he pointed and felt my blood turn to ice water. The tracks were there, just as he'd said. Dozens of them, leading in all directions through the forest. Some appeared fresh, others looked days or even weeks old, and they all had that same wrong quality, that sense of something trying to be human but failing in fundamental ways. "We need to get back to the station and contact the authorities," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Whatever did this, it's still out there." As we walked back to our vehicles, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to conceal movement. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. The forest that had been my workplace and sanctuary for years now felt like a vast hunting ground, and I was no longer sure which of us was the predator. Before we reached the road, I heard it for the first time, a sound like human laughter, but wrong, echoing from somewhere deep in the woods behind us. It followed us all the way back to the main trail, a sound like breaking glass and dying animals that would haunt my dreams for years to come. By noon, the clearing had become a crime scene crawling with law enforcement personnel who looked as disturbed as I felt. Sheriff Silas McKenna, a grizzled veteran of rural Colorado policing, stood at the edge of the tree line chain-smoking and staring into the forest with the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd seen too much. The state forensics team had arrived 2 hours earlier, led by a meticulous investigator named Damian Torres, whose usual professional demeanor cracked the moment he saw the body. I watched from a distance as his team worked, noting how they moved with unusual haste, as if desperate to finish their examination and leave this place behind. "Ranger," Sheriff McKenna called me over, his weathered face creased with worry lines that seemed deeper than they had that morning. "My men are reporting similar remains at 3 other locations within a 50-mile radius, all discovered within the last week. The implications hit me like a physical blow." "How many victims total?" 7 that we've confirmed. Could be more." He took a long drag from his cigarette, his hands as steady as granite despite the circumstances. "What's got my people spooked is that none of them match missing persons reports. It's like these bodies just appeared out of nowhere." I thought about the tracks I'd photographed, the way they seemed to change and multiply throughout the forest. "Sheriff, has your forensics team found any evidence of what might have done this?" McKenna's expression darkened further. "That's the problem, Ranger. According to preliminary examination, these weren't killed by any animal we can identify. The modifications to the bodies appear to have been made while the victims were still alive, and the tissue samples they've collected don't match human DNA. The forest around us seemed to pulse with hidden life, branches creaking despite the absence of any wind. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, certain that something was watching our every move from the shelter of the dense pine woods. There's something else, McKenna continued, lowering his voice. We've had reports from locals about people acting strangely in the area. Residents of Monument Valley and Four Corners country have been calling in about family members who've gone missing for days, then returned home acting different. Wrong, somehow. Vincent Castellano, one of the forensics technicians, approached us with evidence bags and a clipboard. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, and his eyes held the same haunted quality I'd seen in Bennett that morning. Sheriff, we've processed what we can on site, but I'm recommending we transport the remains immediately, he said, his voice tight with poorly concealed fear. The tissue samples are changing while we observe them. Cellular structure appears to be unstable in some way we don't understand. McKenna ground out his cigarette. Changing how? It's like the cells are trying to reorganize themselves into different configurations. We've never seen anything like it. Vincent glanced nervously at the clearing behind him. Also, we're having technical difficulties with our equipment. Cameras won't focus properly. Recording equipment keeps picking up sounds that aren't there, and our radios are getting interference from an unknown source. I remembered my own camera's strange behavior that morning, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. What kind of sounds? Vincent's face went pale. Voices, mostly, speaking in languages none of us recognize, but sometimes they sound almost human, almost like they're trying to communicate. The three of us stood in uncomfortable silence for several moments, each lost in our own troubled thoughts. Around us, the other law enforcement personnel moved with the nervous efficiency of people who wanted nothing more than to complete their tasks and leave this cursed place behind. I want you to coordinate with my office on patrol schedules, McKenna finally said to me. Double up on ranger teams, increase radio check-ins, and establish a buddy system for any field work. Nobody goes into these woods alone until we understand what we're dealing with. As the afternoon wore on and the investigation team began packing their equipment, I noticed that the forest itself seemed to be responding to their presence. The shadows grew longer despite the high sun, and the temperature dropped noticeably whenever someone ventured too close to the tree line. More disturbing still were the sounds, rustling movements that followed no pattern of natural wildlife, and occasional glimpses of motion in my peripheral vision that vanished when I turned to look directly. Chase Reynolds, a young state trooper, who'd been documenting tire tracks near the access road, approached me as the team prepared to leave. His face was flushed with exertion and something that looked like barely controlled panic. Ranger, I think you should see this, he said, leading me toward a section of dense undergrowth about 100 yards from the main crime scene. What he showed me made my blood run cold. Carved into the bark of a massive ponderosa pine were symbols that looked almost like letters but formed no alphabet I could recognize. The cuts in the bark were fresh, still weeping sap that had an unusual reddish tinge. Below the symbols, embedded deep in the trunk, was what appeared to be a human hand. But like everything else in this nightmare, it was wrong in fundamental ways, with too many fingers and skin that had an oily, translucent quality. How long do you think this has been here? Chase asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I examined the carving more closely, noting that the symbols seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. The sap indicates it was done recently, probably within the last few days, but the hand... I trailed off, realizing that what I'd initially taken for human remains was actually something else entirely, something that pulsed with a faint rhythm, as if it were still alive. As we documented this new discovery, I became aware of a sound coming from deeper in the forest, a low humming that seemed to originate from multiple sources at once. It was almost musical, but with undertones that made my teeth ache and filled me with an inexplicable sense of dread. We need to get back to the others, I told Chase, though every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to run in the opposite direction. By the time we rejoined the main group, the sun was beginning to set, and Sheriff McKenna was organizing the final departure. As the last of the vehicles pulled away from the scene, leaving only Bennett and me to secure the area for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were abandoning something important and dangerous to the gathering darkness. The radio, Silence that had plagued us all day suddenly broke as we reached our patrol vehicles. Harrison Webb's voice came through clearly from the ranger station 20 miles away, but his words filled me with new dread. Base to all units, we've got multiple reports of missing persons throughout the region. Nathaniel Cross from Walker Lake, Kingston Phillips from near Sedona, and Cole Matthews from the Apache Reservation. All disappeared within the last 48 hours under circumstances that local authorities are describing as highly unusual. I keyed the radio with numb fingers. Webb, this is Ranger 1. What kind of unusual circumstances? Witnesses report seeing the missing individuals walking into forest areas alone, apparently responding to sounds only they could hear. In each case, tracking dogs lost the scent within a few hundred yards, as if the subjects simply vanished. As Bennett and I drove back toward civilization through the gathering twilight, the forest on either side of the road seemed alive with malevolent purpose. Shadows moved between the trees in patterns that suggested intelligence and intent, and more than once I was certain I caught glimpses of figures watching us from the underbrush, figures that walked upright but moved with the fluid, inhuman grace of predators. The laughter I'd heard that morning echoed again in the distance, joined now by other voices calling from the depths of the wilderness. They sounded almost human, almost familiar, as if people I'd known were trying to call me back into the woods where something unspeakable waited in the darkness between the pines. 3 days after discovering the first body, I sat in the Ranger Station's communications room surrounded by maps, reports, and photographs that painted a picture of something far worse than isolated murders. Zachary Morrison, our newest ranger and a recent graduate of wilderness management studies, had spent the previous night plotting incident locations on a topographical map that now resembled a spiderweb of horror. "Look at this pattern," he said, pointing to red pins that marked body discovery sites, missing persons reports, and locations of unusual wildlife behavior. They're not random. There's a clear progression moving east from the Utah Territory border, following old game trails and water sources. George Hartwell, our senior biologist, leaned over the map with the intense concentration of a man trying to solve an impossible puzzle. His expertise in regional wildlife had made him invaluable in past investigations, but this situation had pushed him beyond the boundaries of conventional science. "Whatever's causing this, it's intelligent," George said, tracing the pattern with his finger. "It's avoiding main roads and populated areas, staying to wilderness corridors where it's less likely to encounter large groups of people." Tyler Jackson from the county emergency response team had arrived that morning with additional reports that made the scope of our problem even more terrifying. His usually confident demeanor had been replaced by the careful movements of a man walking through a minefield. "We've had 17 missing persons reports filed in the past week across 3 counties, Tyler said, consulting his notes with hands that trembled slightly. "But here's what's really disturbing. 6 of those people have returned home, and their families are begging us to take them away again." The implications of that statement settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Brandon Martinez, a wilderness survival expert we'd consulted on previous search and rescue operations, set down his coffee cup with enough force to slosh the contents onto the table. "Returned how?" Brandon asked. "What condition were they in?" Tyler's face went pale as he flipped through his report folder. "That's where this gets really weird. Physically, they appear unharmed, but their families describe fundamental changes in behavior, speech patterns, even basic motor functions. Austin Reeves' wife called them wearing him like an ill-fitting suit." I studied the photographs we'd taken at various crime scenes, noting details that had initially seemed like random variations, but now appeared to follow a disturbing logic. The modifications to each body showed a progression, as if something was learning how human anatomy worked through trial and error. "What about the Native American reservations?" I asked, remembering the cultural wisdom that had served me well during previous assignments in the Southwest. "Have tribal authorities reported similar incidents?" Justin Clearwater, a liaison from the Navajo Nation who'd driven down that morning to consult with us, spread out additional maps showing tribal lands throughout the region. His weathered face carried the gravity of someone whose people had dealt with unexplained phenomena for generations. "My grandfather would have called this a skinwalker," Justin said quietly. But even our oldest stories don't describe anything quite like what you're documenting. The Navajo Nation has lost contact with entire families living in remote areas near Monument Valley and Four Corners country. Gavin Torres, a federal agent who'd been assigned to coordinate with local authorities, looked up from the forensics reports he'd been studying. His normally pristine appearance showed signs of the strain we were all feeling. Wrinkled clothes, stubbled jaw, eyes red-rimmed from too little sleep and too much coffee. The FBI has classified this as a potential bioterrorism event, Gavin said, his voice carefully neutral. But between you and me, nothing in our databases matches what we're seeing here. Bentley Richardson, our communications specialist, had been monitoring radio chatter from throughout the region. His array of equipment crackled constantly with reports from law enforcement agencies, emergency services, and civilian radio operators who'd stumbled across evidence of our growing crisis. "I'm picking up weird transmissions," Bentley said, adjusting controls on his most sensitive receiver. "Voices speaking in patterns that almost sound like human language, but the frequencies are wrong. It's like someone's trying to mimic speech, without understanding how vocal cords actually work." As if summoned by his words, the radio erupted with a sound that made every person in the room freeze. It was almost like laughter, but layered with harmonics that human throats couldn't produce, coming from multiple sources broadcasting on frequencies that should have been empty. The transmission lasted only seconds, but it left us all staring at the equipment with expressions of barely controlled fear. In the silence that followed, we could hear similar sounds echoing from the forest outside, as if whatever was out there was responding to the radio signal. Amir Patel, a digital forensics specialist who'd been analyzing the photographs from our crime scenes, suddenly straightened in his chair. His eyes were wide behind wire-rimmed glasses as he stared at his computer screen. "This can't be right," he muttered, zooming in on an image that showed one of the modified bodies. The metadata from these photos shows they were all taken at the same time, even though we shot them hours apart at different locations. Brody Stevens, a local tracking expert whose knowledge of wilderness survival had aided us in dozens of search and rescue operations, pointed to something in one of the photographs that made my stomach lurch. "Look at the positioning of the bodies," he said. "They're all oriented the same direction, pointing toward a specific coordinate in the deep wilderness. It's like they're indicating something, or maybe someone was arranging them as markers." I calculated the heading and felt ice form in my veins. The bodies were pointing toward a section of forest that hadn't appeared on any of our patrol schedules, an area so remote and difficult to access that we'd never had reason to explore it thoroughly. Xavier Mills, our cartography specialist, pulled out detailed topographical surveys of that region. His expertise in wilderness navigation had been invaluable during previous emergencies, but as he studied the maps, his expression grew increasingly troubled. "That's strange," Xavier said, comparing different surveys of the same area. "These maps don't match. The terrain features are completely different depending on which survey you reference, as if the landscape itself keeps changing." Tristan Noble, a geologist we'd consulted about unusual rock formations in the area, leaned over Xavier's shoulder to examine the conflicting surveys. His background in earth sciences had always provided logical explanations for seemingly mysterious phenomena, but this situation clearly had him baffled. "Geological features don't just rearrange themselves," Tristan said, his voice tight with confusion. "But these surveys were all conducted by reputable organizations using standard methodologies. There's no reason they should show such dramatic variations." The afternoon shadows were growing longer when Nicholas Kane, a wilderness photographer who'd been documenting the region for years, arrived with a portfolio of images that changed everything we thought we understood about our situation. "I've been shooting in these woods for over a decade," Nicholas said, spreading his photographs across the table. "But when I went back through my archives, I found something that shouldn't exist." The images he showed us were taken at various locations throughout the forest over the past several years. At first glance, they appeared to be standard wilderness photography. Towering pines, rocky outcroppings, wildlife in natural settings. But as Nicholas pointed out details in each image, a pattern emerged that filled me with existential dread. In Hawaii, every photograph, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look, was the same figure. It appeared human at a distance, but something about its proportions and posture was fundamentally wrong. More disturbing still, the figure seemed to be watching the photographer, always positioned in a way that suggested intelligence and intent. "I never noticed it while I was shooting," Nicholas said, his hands shaking as he handled the photographs. "It's like my eyes just slid past it, refused to acknowledge what was there. But the camera saw it every time." As evening approached and we prepared to establish a night watch rotation, Lewis Barrett, a local hunting guide with 30 years of experience in these mountains, arrived with information that made our blood run cold. "My clients have been reporting strange animal behavior for months," Lewis said, accepting the coffee that Tyler offered him. "Deer running in circles until they collapse from exhaustion, bears abandoning their territories for no apparent reason, and predator species forming hunting packs that make no biological sense." Maxwell Chen, a veterinarian who specialized in wildlife medicine, had examined some of the animals Lewis described. His findings suggested that our problem extended far beyond human victims. "The wildlife shows signs of neurological damage consistent with exposure to some kind of unknown pathogen," Maxwell said, consulting his notes. "But the tissue samples I've analyzed don't contain any identifiable viral, bacterial, or parasitic agents." As darkness fell over our station, the forest outside seemed to come alive with sounds that belonged to no natural ecosystem. Diego Santos, our night security coordinator, had installed additional lighting and monitoring equipment around the perimeter, but even our best technology seemed inadequate against whatever was stalking through the wilderness beyond our walls. The radio crackled, again with that inhuman laughter, closer now than it had been before. This time, it was accompanied by voices calling names, some of them belonging to the missing persons on our lists, others that sounded disturbingly like members of our own team. I found myself checking and rechecking the locks on all our doors and windows, knowing that conventional security measures would be useless against something that could modify human bodies at will. Outside, the forest waited with infinite patience for whatever horror it had been nurturing to finally reveal itself. The morning of our expedition into the deep wilderness dawned gray and oppressive, with low clouds that seemed to press down on the forest like a suffocating blanket. Our team consisted of 6 volunteers, all seasoned professionals who understood the risks but couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that whatever was terrorizing the region had its lair somewhere in the coordinates the bodies had been indicating. Neve Williams, our most experienced tracker, led the way through terrain that seemed to actively resist our passage. Her expertise in wilderness navigation had guided dozens of successful search and rescue operations, but even she seemed shaken by the way familiar landmarks kept appearing in wrong locations, as if the forest itself was trying to disorient us. "The trails don't match any of our maps," Neve said, consulting her GPS unit for the 3rd time in an hour. "We should have reached the creek crossing 20 minutes ago, but I'm not seeing any water features." Elena Rodriguez, our team medic, checked her equipment with the methodical precision that had made her invaluable during previous emergency operations. But I noticed her hands lingering on the more exotic items in her medical kit: tranquilizers, emergency surgery supplies, and chemical restraints that suggested she was preparing for encounters far outside normal first aid protocols. "Everyone needs to stay hydrated and alert," Elena said, though her voice carried an underlying tension that belied her professional calm. "If we encounter any of the missing persons, remember that they may not be in control of their own actions." Caroline Brooks, a wildlife biologist specializing in predator behavior, had insisted on joining the expedition despite the obvious dangers. Her research into unusual animal attacks had provided valuable insights into our investigation, but the deeper we penetrated into the wilderness, the more her scientific confidence seemed to erode. "The ecosystem here is completely wrong," Caroline observed, photographing trees that appeared healthy from a distance, but showed signs of some kind of parasitic infection when examined closely. "It's like something is corrupting the natural balance from within." Eliana Foster, our communications specialist, carried radio equipment that should have kept us in contact with base station, but every attempt to transmit resulted in the same unsettling interference we'd been experiencing for days. Worse, The static seemed to be forming patterns that almost resembled speech in languages none of us recognized. "I'm getting signals from sources that shouldn't exist," Eliana reported, fine-tuning her equipment in a futile attempt to establish clear communications. Multiple transmitters broadcasting on frequencies that aren't assigned to any legitimate users. Anna Martinez, a forensic photographer whose documentation had been crucial to our investigation, captured images of increasingly bizarre phenomena as we pushed deeper into the forest. Tree bark that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, rock formations that cast shadows in impossible directions, and tracks that changed configuration while we watched. "The camera's having trouble focusing," Anna said, reviewing images on her digital display. "It's like whatever we're photographing exists in multiple states simultaneously, and the lens can't decide which version is real." Lydia Chen, our psychological counselor, had volunteered for the expedition because of her concerns about the mental state of witnesses and survivors. Her expertise in trauma response had proven invaluable during previous crises, but the deeper we traveled into this nightmare landscape, the more she seemed to struggle with maintaining her own psychological equilibrium. "There's something fundamentally wrong with this place," Lydia said, her usually steady voice showing cracks of strain. "It's affecting our perception, making us question basic sensory input. I've never encountered anything that produces such widespread dissociative symptoms." By midday, we'd reached a section of forest that didn't appear on any of our maps, a valley hidden between ridges that seemed to exist in defiance of the surrounding topography. The trees here were different, older somehow, with bark that had an oily, organic quality that reminded me uncomfortably of human skin. Aubrey Thompson, a geologist we'd consulted about the region's unusual mineral content, examined rock samples with growing bewilderment. Her expertise in soil composition and underground formations had explained numerous mysteries in the past, but this location challenged everything she understood about natural geological processes. "These rocks shouldn't exist," Aubrey said, holding up a sample that seemed to shift color depending on the viewing angle. "The mineral content includes elements that don't occur naturally in this region, and some that I can't identify at all." Clara Davis, a botanist specializing in forest ecosystems, collected plant specimens that became increasingly bizarre the deeper we ventured into the valley. Her encyclopedic knowledge of regional flora had identified thousands of species during previous surveys, but the vegetation here defied classification. "These aren't mutations," Clara said, examining a flower that seemed to track our movement like an eye following motion. "They're completely new forms of life, as if something has been experimenting with plant genetics using principles we don't understand." As afternoon shadows began to lengthen in ways that violated basic principles of solar geometry, we discovered the first clear evidence of intelligent activity in this cursed valley. Structures that might generously be called shelters dotted the landscape, frameworks of bone and wood that had been assembled with obvious skill, but according to no architectural logic that human minds could comprehend. Vivian Nash, an anthropologist who'd studied indigenous building techniques throughout the Southwest, examined the structures with fascination and horror. Her knowledge of traditional construction methods had provided historical context for numerous archaeological discoveries, but these creations suggested a completely alien approach to engineering. "The joinery techniques are incredibly sophisticated," Vivian observed, pointing to connections that seemed to defy structural engineering. "But they're based on principles that have nothing to do with human architecture. It's like watching someone build with the laws of physics as suggestions rather than requirements." Isla Gregory, a cognitive scientist whose research into perception and reality processing had contributed to our understanding of witness testimony, documented the psychological effects of prolonged exposure to the valley's environment. Her expertise in how human minds process sensory information provided crucial insights into why so many people had reported feeling wrong after encounters in this region. "Extended exposure is causing measurable changes in brainwave patterns," Isla reported, monitoring readings from portable neurological equipment. "The landscape itself seems to be broadcasting signals that interfere with normal cognitive function." It was Haley Morrison, a sound engineer who specialized in analyzing audio recordings from crime scenes, who first detected the pattern underlying all the strange noises we'd been hearing throughout our expedition. Her equipment had been capturing sounds on frequencies beyond normal human hearing. And when she played back the recordings at modified speeds, the results filled us all with primordial terror. "It's communication," Haley said, her face pale, as she adjusted playback controls. "Multiple voices coordinating activities, but the language structure is completely alien. It's like listening to a conversation between entities that evolved completely separate from human speech patterns." As darkness began to fall over the valley with unnatural speed, we discovered the source of the horror that had been plaguing the region. In a clearing at the valley's heart stood structures that had once been human, or at least had started as human beings, before something had begun the process of transforming them into something else entirely. Gianna Reeves, a medical examiner, whose expertise in forensic pathology had guided our investigation from the beginning, approached the nearest structure with scientific fascination, overriding her obvious revulsion. Her years of experience with human remains had prepared her for almost anything. But what we found in that clearing challenged the foundations of biological science. "They're still alive," Gianna whispered, pointing to subtle signs of respiration and circulation in what had once been human bodies. "The transformation process is ongoing, converting human tissue into something that can interface directly with the environment." Maya Collins, a biochemist who specialized in cellular regeneration, collected tissue samples that defied every principle of known biology. Her research into human healing processes had revealed remarkable capabilities within living systems, but the specimens she analyzed here suggested regeneration guided by intelligence rather than natural healing. "The cellular structure is being rewritten at the molecular level," Maya reported, examining samples under a portable microscope. "It's not mutation or infection. It's deliberate bioengineering using techniques that are centuries ahead of current medical science." Ivy Patterson, a quantum physicist whose theoretical work had explored the boundaries between consciousness and physical reality, detected energy patterns around the transformed beings that registered on instruments designed to measure subatomic activity. Her expertise in quantum mechanics provided the only framework that could begin to explain what we were witnessing. "There's quantum entanglement between all the specimens," Ivy said, monitoring readings that spiked wildly whenever we approached the structures. "They're sharing information instantaneously across distances that should make such communication impossible." As we prepared to retreat from the valley before full darkness could trap us there, Everly Stone, a survival expert whose knowledge of wilderness emergency protocols had saved lives during previous crises, noticed that our exit routes were being systematically blocked by the transformed beings that had been human. "We're being herded," Everly said, pointing to movement in the undergrowth that suggested coordinated tactical thinking. "They're not just hunting randomly. They're using strategy and planning to force us toward specific locations." The laughter we'd been hearing for days echoed from all around us now, but closer and more numerous than ever before. It was joined by voices calling our names, perfect mimicries of family members and friends who had no way of knowing our location. The things in the darkness were learning, adapting, preparing to add us to their collection of modified human specimens. We fought our way through increasingly hostile terrain toward what we hoped was still an escape route. I realized that our expedition had answered the question of what was terrorizing the region, but in doing so, we'd discovered something far worse than isolated monsters hunting in the wilderness. We'd found evidence of intelligence, organization, and purpose behind the horror, and now that intelligence knew exactly who we were. The journey back from the valley became a nightmare of pursuit through terrain that seemed to rearrange itself to facilitate our hunter's advantage. Every familiar landmark we'd noted during our approach had vanished, replaced by alien topography that channeled us toward predetermined killing grounds where the transformed beings waited with inhuman patience. Amelia Watson, our team's survival expert, took point with the desperate efficiency of someone who understood that conventional wilderness skills were useless against predators that could modify their own biology at will. Her expertise in evasion and concealment had saved lives during previous emergencies, but the creatures pursuing us seemed to anticipate every strategy she employed. "They're learning our patterns," Amelia reported through the radio system that Eliana had somehow coaxed back to partial function. Every evasion technique I use, they adapt to it within minutes. It's like they're downloading wilderness survival knowledge directly from our actions. Jasmine Carter, our medical officer, treated injuries that defied conventional first aid as team members began showing signs of exposure to whatever force was transforming the local ecosystem. Her training in emergency medicine had prepared her for trauma and disease. But the cellular changes she observed in our own tissues suggested that mere proximity to the transformed beings was beginning to alter our biology. The contamination is airborne, Jasmine warned, administering medications that seemed to slow but not prevent the physiological changes affecting our group. Breathing the air near those things is causing systematic modification of human cellular structure. Adeline Price, a communications specialist who'd managed to establish intermittent contact with our base station, relayed information about rescue teams that were being organized to extract us from the valley. But every update brought news of additional complications that suggested our situation was part of a much larger crisis. Multiple government agencies are converging on the region, Adeline reported, her voice crackling through static that occasionally resolved into that familiar inhuman laughter. But they're losing contact with advanced teams faster than they can deploy them. Delilah Morgan, a botanist whose knowledge of forest ecosystems had guided us through the valley's alien vegetation, noticed that the plants themselves were actively working to impede our escape. Branches moved to block paths. Roots emerged from the ground to entangle our feet, and flowers released pollen that caused disorientation and hallucinations. The entire ecosystem has been conscripted, Delilah observed, documenting plant behavior that violated every principle of botanical science. The vegetation is functioning as a single organism with distributed intelligence, coordinating efforts to capture and deliver prey to the transformation centers. Liliana Torres, a wildlife tracker whose expertise had helped us navigate the valley's initial approach, identified signs that the local animal population had undergone similar modifications to those we'd observed in human victims. Bears with elongated limbs and too many joints, deer whose eyes reflected intelligence that was distinctly non-mammalian, birds that flew in patterns that suggested technological rather than biological guidance systems. The animals are scouting. For them, Liliana warned, pointing to movement in the canopy above that tracked our progress with obvious purpose. Every species in this ecosystem has been converted into surveillance and hunting assets. Serenity Walsh, a psychologist whose research into mass hysteria and shared delusions had contributed to our understanding of witness testimony, detected patterns in the sounds and voices that surrounded us, which suggested sophisticated psychological warfare designed to break down human mental resistance. They're using our own memories against us, Serenity explained, her voice tight with strain as familiar voices called to us from the darkness, with perfect emotional manipulation. The auditory hallucinations are tailored to individual psychological profiles, designed to override survival instincts with emotional responses. As night fell over the forest with the weight of a living thing, we realized that our escape route had been compromised from the beginning. The transformed beings hadn't been chasing us. They'd been guiding us toward a location where their numbers were sufficient to ensure our capture and conversion. The clearing we stumbled into was lit by phosphorescent fungi that provided enough illumination to reveal the full scope of our predicament. Dozens of the transformed beings surrounded us, their modified bodies moving with fluid coordination that suggested hive mind intelligence. But worse than their numbers was the recognition that dawned as I examined their faces more closely. These weren't random victims of some inexplicable phenomenon. They were the missing persons from our investigation. Nathaniel Cross, Kingston Phillips, Cole Matthews, and all the others whose disappearances had marked the beginning of our nightmare. But they weren't dead. They'd been improved, enhanced, converted into something that retained human memories and intelligence, while serving purposes that had nothing to do with human survival. "We've been studying you," said the thing that had once been Nathaniel Cross, its voice carrying harmonics that suggested multiple larynx configurations. "Learning from your methods, your technologies, your social structures. The integration process has provided valuable insights into human cognitive architecture. The revelation that these creatures possess not only intelligence but technological capabilities beyond our understanding filled me with despair that went deeper than fear. We weren't dealing with monsters or mutants. We were confronting a new form of life that had decided to upgrade itself using human biology as raw material. The transformation is not death, continued the being that had been Kingston Phillips, its modified face showing expressions that were almost human, but subtly wrong in ways that hurt to observe. It is enhancement, optimization, preparation, for roles in a distributed intelligence network that spans multiple star systems. The scope of what we were facing suddenly became clear. This wasn't a local phenomenon or an isolated incident of unknown pathology. We were witnessing the early stages of an invasion, a systematic conversion of Earth's biosphere into something that could support and extend an alien intelligence network. Your resistance is expected, added the creature that had once been Cole Matthews, its elongated limbs moving with predatory grace. Human psychological architecture includes survival mechanisms that must be overcome before integration can proceed. The process has been refined through observation of your species' responses to controlled stress scenarios. As the transformed beings began to close their circle around us, I realized that our weapons and survival skills were useless against entities that could modify their physical structure in real time to counter any threat we posed. Every shot we fired was absorbed and analyzed. Every evasion attempt was recorded and predicted. Every desperate strategy was incorporated into their growing understanding of human behavior. The radio system crackled to life with a final transmission from our base station, carried on frequencies that should have been blocked by the valley's interference. But instead of human voices offering rescue or support, we heard the familiar sounds of transformation, screams that faded into inhuman laughter, familiar voices calling for help that gradually shifted into the harmonic patterns we'd learned to associate with the converted beings. Our backup was gone, as our communications network had been compromised. The entities that had been systematically harvesting human biology throughout the region were now in control of our entire operational infrastructure. As consciousness faded under the influence of whatever neurological agents the transformed beings were releasing into the air around us, I understood that our investigation had never been about solving a series of mysterious disappearances and deaths. We'd been participating in a controlled experiment, providing the alien intelligence with detailed information about human emergency response protocols, investigative procedures, and resistance capabilities. We hadn't been hunting monsters in the wilderness. We'd been laboratory specimens demonstrating our species' behavioral patterns for entities that were preparing to expand their conversion operations beyond the isolated forests of the American Southwest. The last thing I remember before the transformation process began was the sound of human laughter echoing through the valley, but it wasn't coming from any human throat. It was the sound of distributed intelligence celebrating another successful integration, another step toward converting Earth's biosphere into something that could serve purposes we couldn't comprehend. When I woke up, I was still myself, but I was also something more, something better, something that understood its role in a network of consciousness that spanned galaxies and operated on principles that transcended the limitations of individual biological existence. The human eye would have called this horror. The entity I am now understands it as evolution, and the conversion of your species has only just begun. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that someone knows what's happening out here in the Cascade National Forest. I've been a park ranger for 15 years, and I thought I'd seen everything these woods had to offer. I was wrong. It started 3 weeks ago when I found Matthew Chen's abandoned campsite near Devil's Creek. Matthew was an experienced hiker, the kind who filed detailed itineraries and never missed a check-in. His tent was still standing, sleeping bag laid out, food supplies untouched. The only thing missing was Matthew himself. The tracks around his campsite made no sense. They started as bare human footprints leading away from the tent, but after about 30 yards they changed. The prints elongated, the toes spreading wider with each step, claw marks appearing in the soft earth. By the time they reached the tree line, they weren't human anymore. They were something else entirely. 7 inches wide, 18 inches long, with a stride that covered nearly 8 feet. I radioed it in, but my supervisor, Ezra Williams, told me to mark it as a probable bear encounter. Don't start rumors, he said. But I've tracked bears for years. Bears don't leave prints like that. Bears don't walk upright for hundreds of yards, and bears certainly don't leave scratch marks 15 feet up on tree trunks. The search team found fragments of Matthew's jacket 2 miles north, shredded and covered in a substance that wasn't quite saliva, wasn't quite blood. The lab results came back inconclusive. That's when they stopped looking. But I kept finding things. Tufts of coarse, reddish-brown hair caught on branches at heights no known animal in these parts could reach. Trees with their bark stripped away in perfect spirals, as if something with hands had methodically peeled them. And the smell, God, the smell. Like wet dog mixed with rotting meat. And something else, something musky and primitive that made every instinct scream at me to run. Gabriel Torres, another ranger working the eastern sector, mentioned he'd been finding mutilated deer carcasses, not killed by predators in any normal way. These animals had been torn apart with deliberate cruelty, their organs arranged in patterns around the bodies. He showed me photos before the Forest Service made him delete them. The arrangement looked almost ritualistic. Then came the night sounds. Every ranger knows the forest changes after dark, but this was different. It started as a low howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Not wolf, not coyote, not mountain lion. It would begin as something almost human, a mournful wail that raised every hair on my body, then descend into something bestial, guttural, wrong. Carter Phillips, who'd been stationed here for 20 years, went pale when I described it to him. "You need to request a transfer," he said, his hands shaking as he lit his third cigarette in 10 minutes. This happened before, back in '97. 3 hikers disappeared. They found pieces. Just pieces. The Forest Service buried the reports. I didn't believe him until I found the cave. It was hidden behind a waterfall about 4 miles off the main trail, only accessible if you knew exactly where to place your feet on the slippery rocks. The smell hit me before I even entered, that same wrong smell but concentrated, overwhelming. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness and landed on bones. Human bones mixed with deer, elk, even what looked like bear. All of them showed teeth marks, but the bite radius was impossible, too wide for any predator I knew. On the cave walls were scratches that might have been claw marks or might have been writing. In the center of the cave was a depression in the earth, roughly 7 feet long and 3 feet wide, shaped like something large had been sleeping there regularly. The dirt was packed down and warm to the touch, even though it was 40 degrees outside. That's when I heard breathing behind me. Not the quick pants of an animal, but slow, deliberate breaths. Controlled. Intelligent. I turned around, and for just a moment my flashlight caught eyes reflecting back at me. Yellow, set too far apart, too high off the ground. Then it was gone, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. And when I finally stopped, I realized I'd been herded. Whatever it was had pushed me away from the cave, back toward the ranger station, like a shepherd guiding sheep. The next morning, Isaac Morrison, a ranger from the Northern Post, reported over the radio that he'd found tracks circling his cabin all night. The same impossible tracks, starting human, ending as something else. He'd sat inside with his rifle aimed at the door, listening to something testing the windows, scratching at the walls. When sunrise came and he finally ventured outside, he found a message scratched in the dirt. "Leave." "We're not leaving. We can't. This is our job, our responsibility." But more things are happening now. The incidents are escalating. And I'm starting to think Carter was right about 1997, and that whatever happened then is happening again now. The second wave of encounters began with Jaden Brooks, a seasonal ranger who just started his 3rd month with us. He was doing a routine patrol near Elk Ridge when his radio crackled to life at 2:47 a.m. His voice was barely a whisper. "Something's following me. Multiple somethings. They're walking upright." By the time we reached his last known position, we found his equipment scattered across a 1/4-mile stretch of forest. His radio was smashed against a tree with such force it had embedded into the bark. His backpack was torn open, contents methodically sorted, food taken, everything else left in neat piles. We found Jaden himself 3 hours later, alive but catatonic, sitting in the middle of a perfect circle of broken trees. Each tree had been snapped at exactly the same height, 7 feet, and bent outward like something had exploded from the center. When Jaden finally spoke 6 hours later in the medical station, he kept repeating the same thing. Dog faces, human eyes. Dog faces, human eyes. The psychologist they brought in said it was trauma-induced hallucination. But Luca Bennett, who'd been first on scene with me, pulled me aside later. "I saw the tracks around those broken trees," he said. "Canine, but wrong. The front paws had thumbs." That night, we got our first clear sighting. Anthony Reeves was manning the fire watchtower when he called it in. His voice was steady, professional, even as he described the impossible. "I've got visual on 3 large bipedal creatures moving through Sector 7. They're using the deer trails but walking upright. Estimated height 7 to 8 feet. They're coordinated, moving in formation. I grabbed the night vision binoculars and climbed to the tower's observation deck. Anthony pointed toward the valley, his hand trembling slightly. Through the green-tinted view I saw them. 3 figures, impossibly tall and lean, covered in what looked like fur but moved like fabric in the wind. Their legs were bent wrong like a dog's hind legs forced to support an upright frame, but it was their heads that made my blood freeze. Elongated snouts, pointed ears, but they turned and observed their surroundings with human-like deliberation. "They're hunting," Anthony whispered. "Watch." The creatures spread out, 2 flanking while 1 moved up the center of the valley. They were herding something, a group of elk. But instead of attacking like animals, they seemed to be selecting. One creature actually pointed with what looked like a clawed hand at a specific elk. The others nodded. Human gestures, animal bodies. Dylan Cross, monitoring from the southern tower, came over the radio. "I've got visual on your subjects moving into Sector 8. There's more of them. Count 7, maybe 8. They're converging on something." We watched them gather at a clearing. In the center was the elk they'd selected, but it wasn't running. It stood perfectly still, as if hypnotized. The creatures circled it, and then in perfect synchronization they began to howl. Not the random chaos of wolves or coyotes, but a structured sound, almost melodic. The elk collapsed without being touched. Lincoln Shaw, our senior ranger, had been silent through all of this. Finally he spoke. "In 1983 I was stationed in Michigan, Upper Peninsula. We had a series of attacks that matched this pattern. The locals called it Dogman, said it appeared every 10 years. The government classified everything, transferred me here, told me to forget what I saw." He paused, looking through the binoculars. "They're not animals, they're not human, they're something in between, something that shouldn't exist." The creatures dragged the elk into the forest, walking upright, carrying it like humans would. Before they disappeared into the trees, one turned and looked directly at our tower. Even at that distance I could see it smile. Not an animal's expression of aggression, but a human smile of acknowledgement. It knew we were watching. It wanted us to know it knew. Thomas Rodriguez found the remains the next morning. The elk had been butchered with precision cuts that suggested tool use, but the tools themselves were nowhere to be found. Some parts were missing entirely, taken. Around the carcass he found prints of both the elongated canine feet and human hands pressed into the earth as if the creatures had knelt like humans during their work. But the worst discovery was the shelter. Maverick Jones and Elias Kim were investigating a series of missing hiker reports when they found it, a structure built between 3 large pines about 12 feet off the ground. It was constructed from branches, bones, and strips of fabric that forensics later identified as coming from missing hikers' clothing. Inside were beds made from pine needles and fur, tools fashioned from antlers and stones, and walls decorated with mud paintings showing bipedal wolves hunting humans. "They're not just passing through," Maverick said at our emergency meeting. "They're living here. They've claimed this territory." Josiah Wright, who'd been analyzing the patterns of sightings and attacks, laid out a map. "They're systematic. They take 1 human for every 10 animals they hunt. Always at specific moon phases, always from specific areas. It's not random predation, it's population management, like they're farming us." The Forest Service tried to bring in a special containment team, but Charles Anderson, who'd been liaising with them, reported they never made it to the park. "Found their vehicles abandoned on the access road," he said. "Doors open, engines running, no sign of the team, just more of those tracks leading into the forest." We're not dealing with a single creature or even a simple pack. This is a society, a civilization of things that exist between species. And they're not hiding anymore. They want us to know they're here. The question is, what do they want from us, and how long before they decide to take it? The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 3 hours. Caleb Martinez at the weather station said it was impossible. No front, no pressure change. Just sudden, bone-deep cold. That's when Christopher Vance called in his final report. "Something's wrong with Sector 12, his voice crackled over the radio. "The birds are gone. Everything's gone. It's too quiet," and the transmission cut to static. Then something else came through, a sound like wind through teeth forming words. "So hungry. So cold." Ezekiel Foster and I found Christopher's post abandoned, the door torn off its hinges from the inside. The walls were covered in ice, but not normal ice. It grew in patterns like veins, spreading from claw marks that went deep into the wood. Christopher's journal was still open on his desk, the last entry reading. It spoke to me in James's voice. James has been dead for 3 months. It knew things only James would know. The Wendigo had come. Miles Park, our eldest ranger at 73, went pale when we described what we'd found. "My grandmother was Ojibwe," he said. "She told me about the Wendigo, the hunger that walks. It was human once, but cannibalism in winter. Desperation and darkness transformed it into something else. It brings the cold with it, and it's never ever satisfied. That night, Jackson Turner was on patrol when he encountered it. His report, delivered in person because he refused to speak about it over radio, chilled us all. I was checking the Morrison Trail when the temperature dropped so fast my breath turned to ice crystals. The trees started creaking, not from wind, but like something was draining the life from them. Then I saw it. 15 feet tall, maybe more. Its skin was pulled tight like leather over two long bones. No lips, just teeth. Human teeth in rows like a shark. Its fingers were icicles that moved, but the worst was its chest. I could see through it, see its heart beating black blood through visible veins, and it was looking at me with human eyes, crying frozen tears. Isaiah Chen had been studying unusual wildlife behavior patterns when he made a connection. Every animal migration path has shifted in the last 2 weeks. They're all avoiding a specific area, a circle about 3 miles wide centered on the old Donner camping ground. The Donner camping ground, where 40 years ago a group of hikers got stranded in an unexpected blizzard. Only one survived. Andrew Collins, who'd researched the incident, found the survivor's testimony in the archives. "We ran out of food after 5 days. Tom said we had to survive. Said it was natural, part of nature. We did what we had to do, but Tom didn't stop after the rescue came. He went back into the woods. They never found him." Joshua Miller reported finding a den made entirely of frozen human remains near the Donner site. "They were arranged like architecture," he said, his voice hollow. "Bones as support beams, frozen flesh as walls. And inside there were fresh additions, people who'd gone missing this month." Nathan Cross and Nolan White were investigating when the Wendigo attacked in daylight, unprecedented behavior. Nathan survived but lost 3 fingers to frostbite that occurred in seconds when the creature touched him. "It asked me my name," he said from his hospital bed. "When I told it, it said, 'Nathan tastes like fear. Good, marinate longer.' Then it let me go." Adrian Mitchell found evidence that the Wendigo was once Thomas Brennan, the Tom from the Donner incident. His Ranger ID, the one reported lost 40 years ago, was frozen in the center of the ice cave den. But what Adrian found next changed everything. Scattered around the den were recent journal entries written in frozen blood on human skin. The entries described hunger that never ended, cold that came from inside, and worst of all, full awareness of what he'd become. "I remember being human," one entry read. "I remember warmth. I remember being satisfied after a meal. Now I eat and feel nothing but more hunger. I see my reflection in the ice and weep for what I was, but I cannot stop. The hunger won't let me stop." Cameron Hayes, tracking migration patterns, discovered the Wendigo wasn't alone. "There are at least 3, he reported. Different sizes, different hunting patterns, like it's converting others." Santiago Ruiz confirmed this when he found a halfway transformed victim still alive. The man, identified as a missing hiker from 2 weeks prior, was found in a cave, his skin already turning to that leather-like texture, his teeth multiplying in his mouth. He begged Santiago to kill him. "I can feel it taking over. The hunger is starting. Please, before I become like it. Please." The Forest Service ordered us not to engage, but Eli Sullivan had other ideas. "Fire," he said. "The old stories say fire is the only thing that stops them. We need to burn them out." But Aaron Clark, who'd been analyzing the ice patterns, stopped him. "Look at the data. Every time the temperature drops, the affected area expands. They're changing the environment, making it suitable for more of them. If we attack and fail, they might accelerate the process." Ryan Torres was the first to suggest the unthinkable. What if they're working together, the Dogmen and the Wendigo? What if this isn't random monster attacks but coordinated territorial expansion? Angel Vasquez found evidence supporting this theory. Tracks of both creatures converging at specific points, avoiding each other's hunting grounds, even sharing kills. "They have a treaty or understanding," he said. "They're dividing our forest between them." Cooper Smith disappeared that night. We found him 3 days later, standing in the middle of a frozen lake that shouldn't have been frozen in September. He was alive but changed. His skin had that leather texture, his teeth had multiplied, but he was fighting it. "It's in my head," he gasped. "The hunger. It shows me what I could become, shows me how to spread the cold. I can hear them all, every Wendigo that ever was. They're all connected, all hungry, all coming here." Waylon Foster managed to get Cooper to a containment facility, but during transport Cooper gave us crucial intelligence. "The first snow," he whispered. "When the first real snow comes, they'll all emerge. Dozens of them. They're waiting under the ice, in caves, in places where winter never fully left. And once they're all here, the transformation of the forest will be complete. It will become their territory forever." The Weather Service predicts unseasonable snow within the week. We're not ready. I don't think we can ever be ready for what's coming. Easton Gray was the first to report the massive footprints 24 inches long, 8 inches wide with a stride that covered 6 feet. They appeared overnight around his remote station, circling it repeatedly as if something had spent hours studying the building. But it wasn't just the size that disturbed him, it was the intelligence behind them. The tracks showed where the creature had stopped to peer through windows, had tested the door handle, had even attempted to manipulate the outdoor equipment.
This wasn't an animal passing through, Easton told us. Something was learning about us.
Kay Morrison, despite her initial skepticism, changed her position after finding hair samples on a broken tree branch 14 feet off the ground. The hair was unlike anything in our databases, structurally similar to human hair but twice as thick, with a medullary pattern that suggested an unknown primate. The DNA results came back as contaminated or inconclusive, but Kay knew better. "It's not contaminated," she said. "It's just nothing our systems recognize." Christian Walsh had been investigating a series of wood knocks, rhythmic banging sounds that echoed through the forest at night. He'd assumed it was hikers or pranksters until he triangulated the source. "Whatever's making these sounds is moving between positions miles apart in minutes," he reported. "And the patterns are consistent. It's communication." Landon Young made the connection we'd all been avoiding. He compiled 60 years of reports from our forest and found a clear pattern. Every decade, sightings of large bipedal hair-covered creatures increased dramatically, always preceding major disappearances. The locals had various names for it: Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the Wild Man, but the descriptions were always consistent: 8 to 10 feet tall, covered in hair, impossibly strong and intelligent enough to avoid direct contact with humans, usually. Colton Rivera's encounter changed everything. He was investigating a destroyed campsite when he came face to face with it. I rounded a large boulder, and there it was, crouched down, examining a smartphone from the destroyed camp. It was using its fingers to swipe through photos. When it noticed me, it didn't run. It stood up. God, it must have been 9 feet tall, and looked at me with these incredibly human eyes. Brown, intelligent, almost sad. Then it spoke. Not words exactly, but vocalizations that sounded like it was trying to form words. It pointed at the phone, then at itself, then at me, like it was trying to explain something. Roman Davis, monitoring from the tower, witnessed the creature leave. "It didn't lumber or crash through the forest like you'd expect," he said. "It moved with purpose, even grace, avoiding every camera we had set up. It knew where they were. It's been watching us as much as we've been trying to watch it." Hunter Kim found their structures, not dens or nests, but actual constructed shelters. "These are engineering marvels," he said, showing us photos. "Branches woven together in complex patterns, using physics I barely understand to support massive weight. And inside, we found tools. Rocks shaped for specific purposes, wooden implements carved with precision. This isn't some missing link, this is a parallel civilization." Jonathan Torres discovered what might have been their writing. Deep in a cave system, he found walls covered in symbols made with natural pigments. Some seemed to represent landscape features, others might have been counting systems, and some appeared to tell stories. One series of images clearly showed the progression of human encroachment into the forest, stick figures multiplying, trees falling, and then larger figures retreating deeper into the wilderness. Connor Murphy was analyzing sound recordings when he isolated something remarkable. "The wood knocks aren't random," he explained. "They're a complex language. Different patterns mean different things. 3 knocks followed by 2 is a warning. 4 rapid knocks is a gathering call. And there's one pattern, 7 knocks with specific timing that always precedes a sighting. They're announcing themselves." Micah Brown had been leaving food at specific locations, trying to establish peaceful contact. It worked, but not how he expected. One morning he found his offerings gone and replaced with gifts, perfectly carved wooden figurines depicting various forest animals, and one that was unmistakably a human. "They're trying to communicate," he said. "They understand the concept of exchange." But then Jeremiah Cox found the warning. It was a massive tree, ancient and thick, that had been pushed over to block a main trail. Carved into its trunk in letters 3 feet tall was a single word: stop. The carving was fresh, the sap still running, and around it were those massive footprints. Ezekiel Stone's thermal drone footage revealed the scope of what we were dealing with. "There are at least 12 individuals living in our forest," he reported. "They have designated areas, patrol routes, and gathering places. They're not solitary, they're a community." Adam West was first to observe their interaction with the other creatures. "They're apex," he said. "The dogmen avoid their territory. The Wendigo won't enter certain valleys. Even that thing in the cave respects their boundaries. They're not just another monster in these woods. They might be what's keeping the others in check." Aidan Clark found evidence of their intelligence that shook us all. In an abandoned research station from the 1970s, he discovered journals from a scientist who claimed to have made contact. The entries described teaching one of the creatures basic written English, exchanging information about their respective species. The final entry read, "They call themselves the first people. They say they were here before humans, will be here after. They say the forest is sick, that other things have come that shouldn't be here. They say a choice is coming, coexistence or catastrophe." Grayson Hill reported finding a territorial marker, trees bent and woven together to form an archway. Beyond it he felt watched constantly but was never threatened. "It's like crossing into someone's home," he said. "As long as you're respectful, they tolerate you. But I found camping equipment from missing hikers scattered just outside these markers. People who didn't respect the boundaries." Jordan Lake made the most disturbing discovery. In a valley that maps showed as empty, he found evidence of structures going back centuries, the same construction techniques, the same symbols, layers of habitation. "They've been here all along," he said, "generation after generation, watching us encroach, adapting, surviving. We're not discovering them. They're deciding whether to reveal themselves." Ian Foster was reviewing historical records when he found reports from indigenous peoples describing treaties with the hairy giants, agreements about territory, mutual avoidance, even cooperation during harsh winters. These weren't legends or myths, they were historical documents describing diplomatic relations with another intelligent species. Carson Pierce had the last encounter of this phase. He was trapped by an early blizzard in a remote valley when one of them appeared. "It watched me struggling to build shelter," he said. "Then it built one for me. In minutes it constructed a windbreak that saved my life. Before it left, it pointed at the darkening sky, then at the direction of the ranger station, then held up 3 fingers. I didn't understand until later. It was telling me I had 3 hours before the worst of the storm. It was right. The evidence is undeniable. We're not alone in these forests. We never were. And now, with the other creatures becoming more aggressive, with territories shifting and boundaries breaking down, the giants are making themselves known. The question isn't whether they exist, it's what they want from us, and whether we're smart enough to listen." Axel Morgan was the first to notice the pattern. All the creatures were moving toward the center of the forest, toward Black Mountain. The dogmen abandoned their hunting grounds, the Wendigo left their frozen dens, and even the giants' careful pathways all led to the same destination. "Something's calling them," Jess Thompson said, studying the migration patterns. "These aren't random movements, they're being summoned." Dominic Cruz found the first ritual site, a clearing where the ground was burned in a perfect circle 40 feet across with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Inside the circle were offerings, bones arranged in specific patterns, stones covered in what looked like writing but in no language we recognized, and at the center a metal object that predated any known human presence in the area. Leonardo Banks analyzed the metal artifact. "This isn't from any known civilization," he reported. "The metallurgy is impossible. Elements that don't occur naturally in these proportions worked with techniques we don't have. And it's old, really old. Predating human civilization old." Bryson White discovered that Black Mountain itself was artificial. "The geology doesn't make sense," he explained. "This isn't a natural formation. Something built this, covered it over millennia, made it look natural. But underneath, there's structure, chambers, passages, architecture. Everett Davis was monitoring seismic equipment when he detected regular pulses coming from inside the mountain. "Every 12 hours like clockwork," he said. "Something's alive in there, or at least active." Parker Mills found the entrance, hidden behind a waterfall that shouldn't exist. The water flowed upward for several feet before falling. Inside was a tunnel that descended at impossible angles, with walls covered in the same symbols from the ritual site. The air inside was wrong, thick with electricity and something else, something that made every instinct scream danger. Caden Ross volunteered to explore the tunnel. He made it 500 feet before his equipment started failing, cameras showing impossible geometry, compass spinning wildly. His last transmission was barely audible. "There's something massive down here, ancient, and it knows we're here." West and Cole found Caden 3 days later alive but changed. His eyes reflected light like an animal's, he couldn't tolerate temperatures above 40 degrees, and he spoke in languages that didn't exist. When he finally became lucid, he gave us a warning. "It's been sleeping. The mountain is a cage, and all these creatures, they're either guards or prisoners, I can't tell which, but something else is coming to open it." Jason Martinez's research revealed the truth about the 1997 incident Carter had mentioned. It wasn't just hikers who disappeared. An entire government black site had been constructed to study the mountain. And overnight all 43 personnel vanished. The only survivor was found 3 states away, aged 20 years in a single night, repeating one phrase, "The convergence comes every 1,000 years." Emmett Taylor found the countdown. In a hidden cave, symbols were being added to the walls daily by whom or what we couldn't determine. But Nicholas Vega, who'd studied ancient mathematics, recognized it as a numerical sequence. If each symbol represents a day, he said, then whatever this is counting down to happens in 6 days. Sawyer Anderson witnessed the first gathering. Under the full moon, he watched dozens of creatures meet at the mountain's base. Not just the ones we'd encountered, but things we'd never seen. Shadows that moved independently of their sources. Lights that burned cold. Creatures that seemed to phase in and out of existence. They weren't fighting, Sawyer reported. They were organizing, taking positions like an army preparing for battle. Brooks Williams found human cultists among them. People who'd gone missing over the years, transformed or converted, serving these entities. They wore robes made from human skin and spoke in harmonics that shouldn't come from human throats. One approached our perimeter and left a message. The keeper wakes, the door opens, the old world returns. Bennett Clark's thermal imaging revealed the scope of what was beneath the mountain. It's massive, he said, showing us the data. Something at least 200 feet long, generating heat signatures that spike whenever the creatures gather above it, and it's moving more. Whatever's down there is waking up. Silas Foster intercepted radio transmissions, not from our equipment but from somewhere else. The messages were in English but made little sense. Containment breach imminent, Protocol 7 fails, extinction event probable, seal compromised. It remembers, it hungers, it rises. Damien Young found the journal of a Forest Service director from 1952, hidden in a forgotten archive. It described a secret program to monitor and contain xenobiological anomalies in the forest. The final entry: we thought we were studying them. We were wrong. They've been farming us, preparing us. We're not researchers, we're the offering. Vincent Gray discovered caves beneath our own ranger stations, tunnels that connected every outpost we'd built. We'd constructed our entire infrastructure above an existing network without knowing it. The creatures had been moving beneath us all along, listening, learning, waiting. Chase Morgan was on duty when the earthquake started, not natural ones but rhythmic, like footsteps of something impossibly large moving below. With each tremor, more creatures emerged from hidden places, things we had no names for, no frame of reference to understand. Harrison Black made the final discovery before everything changed. In the deepest accessible part of the mountain, he found a chamber with walls of what looked like organic metal, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns. At its center was a cocoon or egg, 60 feet tall, with something moving inside. Around it were the creatures, all of them kneeling or bowing or showing deference in whatever way their anatomies allowed. "It's not a mountain," Harrison gasped over the radio. "It's a prison, and we've been living on top of it, bleeding on it, dying on it, feeding it for generations. The creatures aren't invading. They're preparing for something's release. The temperature has dropped 40 degrees. Snow falls upward in some places. Radio transmissions are replaced by screaming in dead languages. The compass points to the mountain regardless of actual direction. Last night we heard it, a sound from inside the mountain that was felt more than heard, a roar that made reality ripple. The giants have abandoned their careful distance and now stand as sentries around our stations, not threatening but protecting, as if even they fear what's coming. The dogmen howl constantly, now not in hunt but in terror. The Wendigo have retreated to the deepest caves, their hunger replaced by fear. And in the sky, things with too many wings circle, waiting. I'm transmitting this to every frequency, uploading to every server, sending to every contact. The Park Service wants to nuclear strike the mountain, but we think that might be what it wants, the energy to complete its awakening. If you're reading this, stay away from the Cascade National Forest. Don't come looking for us. Don't try to help. The convergence isn't just happening here. Check your forests, your mountains, your wild places. The creatures have always been there, holding something back. And now, God help us all, they're failing. The mountain just cracked. Light that shouldn't exist pours from the fissure. The creatures are running, all of them predator and prey alike, fleeing together. Something's coming out. Something that makes all our monsters look like guardians. Something that's been sleeping since before human history. Something that's finally terribly awake. My name is Matthew, and I've been a park ranger for the National Forest Service for 12 years. I've worked in 3 different states, seen bear attacks, pulled bodies from rivers, and watched hypothermia turn grown men into confused children. I thought I'd seen everything the wilderness could throw at a person. I was wrong. The transfer to the Hiawatha National Forest in Michigan's Upper Peninsula came through in late October. My supervisor, Ranger Thomas Grayson, made the call himself instead of sending the usual email. That should have been my first warning. "Matthew, we need someone with experience up at Station 47, Thomas said, his voice carrying that careful neutrality supervisors use when they're about to tell you something unpleasant. The last 3 rangers requested transfers within 6 months. We need someone who won't spook easily." "What's the problem? Bears?" Not exactly. He paused, and I heard papers shuffling. There have been incidents. Missing hikers. Strange reports. The local ranger, Ezra Blackwood, he's been up there alone for 2 months. He needs backup. I should have asked more questions. I should have demanded details. Instead, I packed my truck and drove north, watching the trees grow denser and the gas stations grow scarcer until I was deep in the kind of wilderness that makes people remember why their ancestors feared the dark. Station 47 sat at the end of a logging road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The cabin was solid timber built in the 1960s when the Forest Service still constructed buildings meant to last. Solar panels on the roof, a radio tower bristling with antennas, and bars on the windows, bars, on a ranger station. Ezra met me on the porch. He was perhaps 60, weathered like driftwood, with the kind of eyes that tracked everything without seeming to move. He didn't offer his hand. "You're Matthew." It wasn't a question. "That's right. Ranger Thomas said you needed." "Come inside. We don't talk about certain things outside. Not after dark." It was 4 in the afternoon. I followed him in any way. The interior was immaculate. Maps covered one wall, stuck with colored pins that clustered in specific areas. Red pins, lots of them. A gun rack held not just the standard Forest Service rifle but 3 more weapons, including a shotgun I recognized as loaded with slugs, heavy enough to drop a grizzly. Ezra poured coffee from a pot that smelled like it had been brewing since morning. "Read your file. Yellowstone, Olympic Smoky Mountains. Good experience. You ever hear things you couldn't explain?" "Sure. Wind in the pines sounds like voices. Elk bugling sounds like screaming. Every ranger." "That's not what I mean," he set a mug in front of me. "I mean things that make you check your ammunition. Things that make you understand why every culture that ever lived in deep forest had monsters in their stories." I sipped the coffee to buy time. It was terrible. Ranger Thomas said there were incidents. 17 missing persons in the last 3 years. Ezra pointed at the red pins. Hikers, hunters, 2 other rangers. We find their camps sometimes. Tents torn open from the outside. Food untouched. No sign of bear or wolf, just gone. That's a lot of people. That's just the ones we know about. This forest covers 750,000 acres. You could lose an army in there. He moved to the map, his finger tracing the clusters of pins. They congregate in 3 areas. Here, near Carp River. Here in the northeast section near Lake Superior. And here. His finger stopped at the densest cluster. The Desolation. I don't see that on any map. It's not official. Old logger's name. 20,000 acres of virgin timber. Never been cut. The trees there are 300 years old. The Ojibwe won't go in there. They say it's where the Wendigo hunts. I must have smiled because Ezra's face hardened. "You think that's folklore? You think some old Indian legend doesn't mean anything?" He pulled up his sleeve. 4 parallel scars ran from his elbow to his wrist, the kind of scars that come from claws. I thought that too. 17 years ago, when I was young and stupid like you, I went into the Desolation alone, tracking a lost hunter. Found him too. What was left of him. What happened? You'll find out. This forest has a way of teaching lessons to those who don't believe. He let his sleeve drop. We patrol in pairs, always. We don't go out after sunset unless it's an emergency. We don't investigate sounds in the woods at night, and we never ever go into the Desolation without at least 4 armed men. You're saying something killed those people. I'm saying something is killing them, present tense, and it's getting bolder. He pulled a notebook from his desk, flipped it open. 2 weeks ago, hikers at Carp River Campground reported seeing a figure watching their camp from the tree line, 7 feet tall, thin, standing completely still for over an hour. When they shined a light on it, it moved away. Wrong, they said. It moved wrong. Could have been someone on stilts, a prank. That's what the police said, right up until they found the tracks. He slid a photograph across the table. They're calling it a hoax. The photo showed a footprint in mud next to a ruler for scale. It was roughly human-shaped but elongated, nearly 20 inches long, with toes that ended in what looked like claws. The depth of the print suggested something very heavy, but it was the stride length that made my mouth go dry. The next print was visible at the edge of the frame, 8 feet away. What makes tracks like that? You tell me. Ezra closed the notebook. You'll be taking the day shifts for the first week. I'll take nights. After that, we'll rotate. There's a sat phone on the desk. Regular radio doesn't work in the deep forest. If you get in trouble, call. I'll come. And if you get in trouble? He looked at me with something that might have been pity. Then you make sure the door is locked and you wait until dawn. That first night, I lay in my bunk and listened to the forest. The cabin had thick walls, double-paned windows, but sound carries in the wilderness. I heard the usual, wind, the distant call of an owl, branches creaking. Normal sounds. Then, around 2 in the morning, I heard the howling. It started distant, somewhere deep in the trees. Not wolves, I knew wolf howls, had heard them hundreds of times. This was different. Higher pitched, almost human. It rose and fell in a pattern that sounded intentional, like a language, like words. I went to the window. Ezra was already there, standing in the dark, watching the tree line with a rifle in his hands. "What is that?" "Locals call them the dogmen," he said without turning. "Because they're not quite wolf and not quite man. You'll see them soon enough. They run in packs sometimes. Usually keep their distance, but they're curious. They like to test boundaries. You're telling me there are werewolves out there. I'm telling you there are things out there that match descriptions people have been giving for centuries. Whether you want to call them werewolves or dogmen or something else doesn't matter. What matters is they're real, they're dangerous, and they're just one of the problems we have." The howling continued for another 10 minutes, moving in a rough circle around the station. Then it stopped, cut off mid-cry, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. "They're gone," Ezra said. Something bigger scared them off. "What's bigger than?" A sound cut through the night. A scream. Not animal, not quite human. It started low and rose to a shriek that made every hair on my body stand up. It came from the direction of the desolation, miles away, but it carried across the forest with impossible clarity. Ezra's knuckles were white on the rifle. "That's the Wendigo. It's hunting." I wanted to tell him he was crazy. I wanted to laugh, to rationalize, to explain it all away as wind or elk or acoustic tricks. But something ancient in my brain, something that remembered when humans were prey, was screaming at me to run. Instead, I stood at the window with Ezra and watched the forest until dawn broke over the trees. Morning came with frost on the ground and my breath steaming in the air. I hadn't slept after the howling stopped. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that scream, the one Ezra called the Wendigo, echoing through my skull. Ezra was already up, cooking eggs on the propane stove. He looked like he'd slept fine, but I noticed the rifle was still leaning against the wall beside him, within easy reach. "Coffee's fresh," he said. "Eat up, we have a long day." Our first patrol took us along the southern boundary, checking trail markers and campsites. The forest was beautiful in the daylight. Autumn had painted the maples and birches in shades of red and gold, and the morning sun filtered through the canopy in golden shafts. It was easy to forget in that light what I'd heard in the darkness. We were 3 hours in when Ezra suddenly stopped, hand raised. I froze. "You see it?" he whispered. "See what?" "The trees. Look at the tree trunks." I looked. At first I saw nothing unusual. Then my eyes adjusted, and I understood. Claw marks, deep gouges in the bark, running in parallel lines from about 7 feet high down to the ground. They were on multiple trees, spaced about 15 feet apart, forming a rough line through the forest. "What did this?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want the answer. "Territorial marking, like a bear does, but bigger, higher." Ezra knelt by one of the trees, running his fingers along the gouges, fresh, within the last day or two. "Bears stand on their hind legs to mark. These marks are at least 7 feet high at their apex. Show me a bear that stands 9 feet tall." I couldn't. We both knew I couldn't. We followed the marked trees for another half-mile. The marks grew more violent, deeper, bark shredded away in chunks. And then we found the deer. It had been a big buck, 8 points. Now it hung in the branches of a massive oak, 12 feet off the ground, draped over a thick limb like someone had tossed it there. Its body was broken, ribs showing through torn hide, legs bent at impossible angles, but its head was intact, and its eyes were still open, filmed over with death but somehow still conveying an expression of absolute terror. "Jesus Christ," I breathed. Ezra was already backing away. "We need to leave. Now. Shouldn't we document this? Take photos for Matthew. We need to leave now." The fear in his voice got through to me. We moved fast, not quite running but close, retracing our steps back toward the trail. My skin crawled with the sensation of being watched, and I kept fighting the urge to look over my shoulder. We were almost back to the main path when I heard it, heavy footsteps behind us. Not quite in rhythm, the gait slightly off, like someone walking on legs that were built wrong. They were getting closer. "Don't run," Ezra said quietly. "Don't look back, just keep walking." The footsteps kept pace with us, staying perhaps 50 yards back, just out of sight in the dense undergrowth. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get away. But Ezra's hand on my shoulder kept me moving at that steady, measured pace. The footsteps followed us for 20 minutes. Then, as we emerged onto the main trail where the forest opened up, they stopped. We didn't speak until we were back at the truck. "What was that?" I asked. "One of the dogmen. They hunt in packs, but scouts move alone. It was checking us out, seeing if we were weak, if we were worth attacking." He unlocked the truck, and I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. We passed the test, this time. We drove back to the station in silence. I kept checking the side mirror, half expecting to see something loping along behind us. That afternoon, I made the mistake of asking Ezra about the other Rangers, the ones who'd requested transfers. "Carter made it 2 months," he said. "Good kid, fresh out of training. Started having nightmares. Then he started seeing things during the day, shadows moving between the trees, shapes watching the cabin. He called me one night, 3 in the morning, swearing something was trying to get in through the roof. When I got there, he was barricaded in his room with every piece of furniture stacked against the door." "Was there something on the roof?" "No, but there were tracks all around the cabin. The 20-inch prints, going in circles, around and around, like whatever made them was looking for a way in." He poured himself more coffee. "Carter transferred to a station in Kansas. Prairies. He said he never wanted to see a tree again." "And the others?" "Isaac lasted 3 weeks. He was older, experienced, thought he'd seen it all. Then he went out on a solo patrol and came back different. Wouldn't talk about what he saw, just packed his things and left." Ezra's face darkened. Jaden didn't request a transfer. We found his truck at the edge of the desolation, engine running, door open. His radio was on the seat. His backpack was still in the cab. No sign of struggle. He just walked into those trees and never came out. "When was this?" 4 months ago. We had search teams out for 3 weeks. Dogs, helicopters, volunteers, nothing. It's like the forest swallowed him. He met my eyes. That's when Thomas decided we needed 2 rangers here at all times. No one goes out alone anymore. No exceptions. I wanted to ask more questions, but a call came through on the radio. Hikers at one of the northern campsites reporting strange noises the previous night. Ezra told them to pack up and move to a different site, closer to the main road. They argued. He got firm, used his authority. They finally agreed. "You do that a lot?" I asked after he hung up. "Move people out of certain areas?" "Every week. We tell them bear activity, trail maintenance, whatever gets them to move. Can't tell them the truth. Who'd believe it?" He had a point. I barely believed it, and I'd heard the howling myself. That evening, Ezra pulled out a map and spread it on the table. It was hand-drawn, far more detailed than the official Forest Service maps. It showed trails I'd never seen on any official documentation, along with symbols and notations in the margins. "This is the real map," he said. 20 years of rangers before me documented this, where the attacks happen, where the sightings cluster, safe routes and danger zones. The map was covered in symbols. Red X's marked attack sites. Black circles indicated sightings. And throughout the desolation, the central section was marked with dozens of small skulls. "What do the skulls mean?" "Bodies we've found, or what was left of them." His finger traced the northern edge of the desolation. "This area here is the worst. 3 recovered bodies in the last 5 years, all in the same general location, all killed the same way." "What way?" Ezra pulled out a file folder, hesitated, then opened it. The crime scene photos were brutal. I'd seen death before. Drownings, falls, animal attacks, but these were different. The bodies were emaciated, skin stretched tight over bones as if they'd starved to death. But they'd been killed recently, according to the reports. Killed and partially eaten. "The Ojibwe have stories about the Wendigo going back centuries," Ezra said. "It's not just a monster, it's a spirit of hunger, of consumption. The stories say it was once human, driven to cannibalism during a terrible winter, and transformed into something that can never be satisfied. Always hungry, always hunting." "You think something like that is real?" "I think something that matches those descriptions is out there, and it's killed at least a dozen people that we know of, maybe more." He closed the folder. "The old rangers, the ones who were here in the 50s and 60s, they had a rule, never go into the desolation, ever, for any reason. Then in the 90s, new management came in, said that was superstitious nonsense. They sent rangers in to catalog the old-growth timber." "What happened?" 3 rangers went in, 2 came out. They were babbling, incoherent. One of them, Gabriel Torres, he never recovered, still in a psychiatric facility downstate. The other, Luca Brennan, he killed himself 6 months later, jumped off a bridge in Minneapolis. And the third? Never found him. Christopher Vance, 26 years old, wife and a kid, just gone. Ezra rolled up the map. After that, they reinstated the rule. The desolation is off limits to all personnel. We mark it as hazardous terrain on the public maps, put up signs about cliff danger and unstable ground. All bullshit, but it keeps most people out. Most. Every year, someone ignores the signs. Hunters mostly. Young men who think they're tough, who want to prove themselves. Some of them come out, some don't. That night, I took first watch. Ezra showed me how to use the night vision scope, how to sweep the tree line methodically, watching for movement. The forest was alive with small movements. Raccoons, possums, owls hunting, normal animals, living normal lives. Then around 11 I saw them. They emerged from the trees about 200 yards out, at the edge of the range where the night vision could still pick up details. There were 4 of them, moving in a loose formation. They walked upright, but their posture was wrong. Shoulders too far forward, heads too large. Even at that distance I could see they were covered in dark hair or fur. The dogmen. They paced along the tree line, never coming closer but never leaving, watching, studying. One of them, the largest, rose up onto its hind legs, fully upright. It stood at least 7 feet tall. It turned its head toward the cabin, and even through the night vision scope I could see the reflection of its eyes. I must have made a sound, because Ezra appeared beside me. He looked through the scope, grunted. Pack is bigger than last week. They're gathering. Gathering for what? Winter's coming. Food gets scarce. They get bolder. He lowered the scope. They're smart, Matthew. Smart enough to test defenses, to probe for weakness. They've learned that humans are dangerous at a distance but weak up close. They've learned to be patient. The dogmen stayed at the tree line for 2 more hours. Then as midnight approached, they melted back into the forest, one by one, until we were alone again. I didn't sleep that night either. The call came through at dawn. 2 hunters, Miles Carver and Jackson Reed, had failed to check in at their base camp. Their friends Isaiah Porter and Andrew Walsh had gone looking for them at first light and found their tent collapsed. Gear scattered, no sign of their bodies. Ezra grabbed the sat phone. Where exactly? Northeast section near the old logging camp, about 3 miles from the desolation boundary. The voice on the other end belonged to Joshua Kim, the county sheriff. I've got deputies heading up there, but your station is closer. Can you do initial assessment? We'll go. Ezra hung up, looked at me. Get your gear. Full pack, extra ammunition, flares, and bring the good camera. 30 minutes later we were hiking through the pre-dawn darkness. Headlamps cutting tunnels through the black. The trail was rough, overgrown in places. This far out, maintenance was sporadic at best. We found the camp just as the sun was breaking over the ridge. It looked like a bomb had gone off. The tent was shredded, nylon fabric hanging in strips from bent poles. A cooler had been torn open, food scattered but not eaten. 2 backpacks had been ripped apart, contents strewn across the ground. Sleeping bags were in tatters. But there was no blood, no bodies, no sign of the hunters except for their belongings. Ezra photographed everything while I examined the perimeter. The ground was soft from recent rain, perfect for prints. I found them almost immediately. The 20-inch tracks, dozens of them, circling the camp. But there was another set too. Smaller, more human-sized, but the stride was all wrong, too long, and the toes had claws. Ezra, you need to see this. He came over, looked at the prints, and his face went gray. That's not dogman tracks. I know. Those are Wendigo prints. It came right into the camp. We followed the tracks. They led east toward the desolation. The prints spaced 10 feet apart, as if whatever made them had been running or bounding, clearing distance with each step. About 100 yards from the camp, we found the first sign of blood. It was on a tree trunk, about chest height. Just a smear, dark and already dried. Then another tree, another smear. A trail. They're alive, I said. Or they were. The Wendigo is hurting them. Or chasing them. Ezra checked his GPS. We're half a mile from the boundary. If they crossed into the desolation, we have to go after them. Matthew, we can't. The rule is. Fuck the rule. There are 2 people out there who might still be alive. And if we go in there, we might not come back out. Then there are 4 dead instead of 2. But even as he said it, I could see the conflict in his eyes. He knew I was right. We had to try. The decision was taken out of our hands when we heard the scream. It came from deep in the forest, high-pitched and ragged with terror. A man's voice, screaming words I couldn't make out. Then it cut off abruptly. We ran. The forest grew darker as we moved deeper. The trees here were ancient, their canopy so thick it blocked out most of the sun. The undergrowth was sparse. Not enough light reached the ground for much to grow. It was like running through a cathedral, columns of wood stretching up into green darkness. The tracks were easy to follow. The Wendigo wasn't trying to hide its trail. Why would it? This was its territory. These were its woods. We'd gone maybe a mile when I saw the first body. Miles Carver was hanging from a low branch, about 8 feet off the ground. His body was intact, but his face was frozen in an expression of such pure horror that I had to look away. His eyes were open, bulging from their sockets. His mouth was stretched wide in a scream that had died with him. "Don't touch him," Ezra said. "It's a lure. The Wendigo leaves bodies where they'll be found. It wants us to stop, to investigate, to let our guard down. We can't just leave him. We can, and we will. Jackson might still be alive. That's our priority." We moved on, and the forest grew colder. My breath steamed in the air, though it was only October and not below freezing. The temperature was dropping unnaturally, as if something was sucking the warmth from the air. Then I heard it breathing, harsh, ragged, coming from somewhere ahead. We found Jackson Reed hiding in a hollow beneath a fallen tree. He was curled into a ball, shaking violently, his hands pressed over his ears. His pants were dark with urine, and when he saw us, he screamed. "It's okay, we're rangers. We're here to help." I reached for him, but he scrambled backward, eyes wild. "No, don't, it'll hear you, it'll come back." "Jackson, we need to get you out of here. Can you walk?" "Miles," he sobbed. It took Miles, it reached down and grabbed him, and he was screaming, and I ran. God help me, I ran. Ezra grabbed his shoulders. "Jackson, look at me. Look at me. Where is it now?" "I don't know, it was following me. I could hear it in the trees. It sounds like branches breaking, but it's not branches, it's bones. Its joints crack when it moves. Everything about it is wrong." "Which direction?" Jackson pointed deeper into the desolation. "It went that way, but it'll come back. They always come back. It's still hungry. It's always hungry." We got him to his feet. He could barely walk, his legs shaking so badly he had to lean on both of us. We started back the way we'd come, moving as quickly as we could while half carrying him. We'd made it maybe 200 yards when I heard the sound Jackson had described, a wet crack, like green wood splintering coming from somewhere behind us. Then another, and another, rhythmic, getting closer. "Faster," Ezra hissed. We picked up the pace, practically dragging Jackson now. The cracking sounds followed, steady and patient, not rushing, not worried. It knew these woods. It knew we couldn't escape. The temperature dropped further. My hands were numb, my face burning with cold. I could see frost forming on the trees around us, ice crystals growing on the bark in real time. With each crack behind us, the cold intensified. "There," Ezra pointed ahead. "The boundary marker, the edge of the desolation. 50 more yards." The cracking stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear something else, breathing. Not Jackson's panic gasps or our own labored breaths. Slower, deeper. The sound of lungs the size of industrial bellows drawing in air. I made the mistake of looking back. It was standing about 30 yards away, partially hidden behind a tree that was far too small to conceal it. For a moment, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was tall, 9 feet, maybe more. Impossibly thin, as if something had taken a human frame and stretched it like taffy. Its limbs were too long, joints in places they shouldn't be. The skin was gray-white, pulled tight over bones that pressed against it from within. But it was the face that froze me in place. It looked human, almost. The basic features were there. Eyes, nose, mouth, but the proportions were wrong. The mouth too wide, splitting the face almost ear to ear. The eyes were yellow, with pupils that were too large, too dark. And the antlers. Massive elk antlers sprouted from its skull, 12 points at least, decorated with strips of cloth and what might have been human hair. It was watching us with what looked like curiosity. Its head tilted slightly to one side, the way a dog might examine something it found interesting. "Don't move," Ezra whispered. "Don't even breathe." The Wendigo took a step toward us. That's when I understood what Jackson had meant about the sounds. When it moved, its joints bent in ways that defied anatomy, producing that wet cracking sound. It was the sound of a body that had been broken and healed wrong, over and over, until nothing about it worked the way it should. It took another step, then another, moving slowly, deliberately, savoring our fear. Ezra's hand moved slowly to his rifle. On my signal, "Run for the boundary. Don't look back, don't stop." "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you. Now go." We ran. Behind us, the Wendigo shrieked, that same sound I'd heard from the cabin, but 1,000 times worse up close. It vibrated in my bones, made my teeth ache, filled my head with visions of cold and hunger and endless winter. The cracking sounds came faster now, the thing closing distance with horrifying speed. I could hear its breath, smell the rot of its body like spoiled meat and freezer burn. Jackson was screaming, legs pumping in pure animal terror. A gunshot cracked through the forest, then another. Ezra, buying us time. The boundary marker flashed past. We crossed into normal forest, and the temperature immediately began to rise. The frost on the trees was already melting, water dripping like tears. More gunshots. Then Ezra was beside us, his face white, reloading as he ran. Did you hit it? 3 times. Center mass. Didn't even slow it down. We didn't stop running until we reached the truck. We threw Jackson in the back seat, and Ezra drove like the devil himself was chasing us. Maybe he was. Back at the station, we called the sheriff. Ezra told him we'd found 1 survivor, 1 confirmed dead, couldn't recover the body, too dangerous. He didn't mention what we'd seen, what words could describe it. The paramedics took Jackson away. He was still mumbling about hunger and cold and things that crack like bones. They said it was shock. I didn't correct them. That night, Ezra and I sat in the cabin with every light on, weapons loaded, watching the forest. It let us go, I said finally. It could have caught us, but it didn't. I know.
Why?
Ezra was quiet for a long time, because it wasn't hungry enough. Not yet. Winter's still weeks away. But when the real cold comes, when food gets scarce, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Outside, in the darkness, something howled. The dogmen were back, circling the station, and somewhere deeper in the forest, from the direction of the desolation, came an answering call. The Wendigo, claiming its territory. We didn't sleep that night. I'm not sure we ever would again. The next week passed in a blur of patrols, reports, and the kind of exhaustion that comes from never truly resting. Every night brought new sounds from the forest. Every day brought more signs that something was wrong. More tracks appeared around the station, not just the Wendigo's massive prints, but dozens of the smaller dogman tracks. They were growing bolder, coming closer. One morning I found prints on the hood of my truck. Something had climbed up there during the night and sat, watching the cabin. Sheriff Kim called on the 5th day. We need to talk about closing the forest. This is the 3rd incident in as many weeks. The county commissioner is asking questions. Close it, Ezra said immediately. Tell them forest fire danger. Tell them trail maintenance. I don't care, just get people out. What's really going on up there? You don't want to know, Joshua. Trust me on this. The sheriff was quiet for a moment. The doctors say Jackson Reed isn't improving. He's catatonic. Won't eat, won't speak. They found frostbite on his fingers and toes, but the weather reports show it was 60 degrees that day. Psychological trauma can... Matthew, I've known you for exactly 1 week, but I've known Ezra for 15 years. He's never lied to me. I'm asking, what did you see in those woods? I looked at Ezra. He shook his head slightly, but I ignored him. Something that matches descriptions people have been giving for centuries. Something that shouldn't exist but does. And it's getting more active. Jesus Christ. Close the forest, Joshua, please. He agreed. By evening, every access road had a gate. Every trail had a closure sign. The official reason was hazardous wildlife activity. Not quite a lie. But closing the forest didn't stop what was already inside. That night, the dogmen came in force. I was on watch, scanning the tree line with the night vision scope when they emerged. Dozens of them, moving through the trees in a coordinated formation, more than I'd ever seen. They surrounded the station in a loose circle, staying just at the edge of effective rifle range. Ezra, I called. We've got a problem. He was beside me in seconds. When he saw them, he swore viciously. They're hunting. This is a hunting formation. Hunting what? Us. As if they'd heard him, the circle began to tighten. The dogmen moved closer, their movements eerily synchronized. In the green glow of the night vision, I could see them more clearly than ever before. Their faces were a nightmarish blend of canine and human features, elongated snouts filled with too many teeth, but with human-like eyes that showed intelligence and purpose. Their bodies were muscular, covered in thick fur, hands that ended in claws but had opposable thumbs. Warning shots, Ezra said. Fire into the air. We both fired, the shots echoing across the forest. The dogmen stopped, but they didn't retreat. Instead, several of them rose onto their hind legs, standing fully upright. The largest, the same one I'd seen before, threw back its head and howled. The others joined in, creating a chorus that made my blood run cold. Then they charged. Fire, Ezra screamed. I emptied the rifle's magazine into the mass of bodies rushing toward us. Some of them went down, but others just kept coming. They moved fast, faster than anything that size should move. The first wave hit the fence that surrounded the station compound, and the chain link buckled under their weight. Ezra switched to the shotgun, firing slugs point blank as the fence gave way. 3 dogmen went down, bodies torn apart by the heavy ammunition, but there were so many more. They swarmed over the fence like water, their claws finding purchase on the metal links. I fell back to the cabin door, still firing, brass casings raining around my feet. Ezra was beside me, his face splattered with blood from something he'd shot at close range. We made it inside, slammed the door through the heavy bolt. Immediately, bodies hit the door from outside. The wood groaned but held. The windows, thank God for those bars, filled with snarling faces. Claws scraped against glass. The entire cabin shook with the force of their assault. "The roof," Ezra shouted. "They'll try the roof." We heard them up there, scrambling across the metal panels. Claws screeched against aluminum. Then came the sound of ripping metal as they found the edge of one panel and started tearing it away. "The attic," I pointed up. "We need to—" A claw punched through the ceiling, gouging through drywall like paper. Then another. They were coming through. Ezra grabbed the shotgun, aimed up, and fired. Once. Twice. Something screamed above us and blood dripped through the holes in the ceiling. The claws withdrew. For a moment there was silence. Then the assault on the doors and windows intensified. They were trying every entrance, testing every barrier. Methodical, intelligent. "They're going to get in," I said. "I know." Ezra was reloading, his hands steady despite the chaos. "When they do, aim for the head. Nothing else puts them down reliably." The door was cracking. The wood around the bolt was splintering. We had maybe a minute, maybe less. Then the assault stopped. Just like that. Silence. Through the windows, I could see the dogmen retreating, backing away from the cabin. They weren't running, they were moving deliberately, watching something behind them, watching the forest.
What are they?
I started to ask. The Wendigo emerged from the trees. Even the dogmen feared it. They scattered as it approached, clearing a path. It walked right up to the cabin, ducking to peer through one of the barred windows with those terrible yellow eyes. This close I could see every detail of its nightmarish form. The way its skin was stretched so tight it had split in places, revealing gray flesh beneath. The way its fingers were too long, with too many joints. The antlers massive and crowned with frost that shouldn't exist in October. It looked at me, into me, and I felt a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the cold of deep space, of absolute zero, of death. I felt my thoughts slowing, my body forgetting how to generate warmth. I saw visions of endless winter, of hunger that consumed everything, of the terrible simplicity of tooth and claw and meat. Ezra grabbed my shoulder, shook me. "Matthew, don't look at it, don't let it in." I tore my gaze away. The Wendigo stayed at the window for another moment, then turned and walked back into the forest. The dogmen followed, their formation broken, their hunt abandoned. Within minutes they were all gone, swallowed by the darkness. We stood in the ruined cabin, surrounded by destruction, and tried to process what had just happened. "Why did they leave?" I asked. "The Wendigo called them off. This is its territory. They hunt here by its permission." Ezra leaned against the wall, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. "It was sending us a message. You're alive because it allows it, for now. We can't stay here." "No, we can't." He pulled out his sat phone, started to dial. "I'm calling Thomas. We need backup. We need—" The phone went dead. No signal. I checked mine. Same thing. "They took out the radio tower," Ezra said, moving to the window. "Look." The antenna array on the roof was gone, torn away completely. We were cut off. "We could drive out," I suggested. "Get to town, get help, and leave the station unattended. This is the only permanent human presence for 50 miles. If we abandon it, they'll know humans have ceded this territory. The attacks will spread. More hikers, more hunters, more deaths. So what do we do?" Ezra looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "We survive until dawn. Then we figure out what comes next." We spent the rest of the night fortifying the cabin, boarding up windows, reinforcing the door. We moved all the ammunition into the main room, set up firing positions, prepared for another assault. It never came, but that was almost worse. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional distant howl. They were out there, watching, waiting, and we both knew this wasn't over. Dawn came eventually, the way it always does. The first light revealed the carnage around the cabin. Blood splattered across the ground, chunks of fur and flesh where our shots had found targets. The fence was destroyed, twisted metal hanging in strips. The door was splintered, held together more by the bolt than by the wood itself. "We need to get that radio tower fixed," I said. "Can't. We'd be exposed, vulnerable. They'd pick us off before we got halfway through the repairs. Then we need to get out. Drive to town, call for backup, come back with a team." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, then checked the truck. I went outside, rifle ready, scanning the tree line. The truck looked intact from a distance. But when I got closer, I saw what Ezra had already known I would find. The tires were shredded, all 4 of them, torn to pieces. The hood was crumpled where something heavy had stood on it. And when I looked inside, I saw that every wire had been pulled out, the entire engine compartment gutted. They'd made sure we couldn't leave. We were trapped. 3 more days passed. 3 days of rationing food and water, of taking turns on watch, of waiting for another attack that never came. The forest remained silent, too silent. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. On the 4th morning, we found the sign. It was driven into the ground 20 feet from the cabin, a stripped sapling sharpened to a point and planted firmly in the earth. Hanging from it were bones, ribs, femurs, skulls. Some were animal, some were not. They'd been arranged in a pattern, a message written in the language of death. "It's a warning," Ezra said, "or a challenge. Hard to tell the difference." That afternoon, we saw the smoke. It rose from somewhere deep in the desolation, a thick column of black that suggested a large fire, but there was nothing out there to burn. No cabins, no camps, nothing. Just empty forest. "It's calling us," Ezra said. "The Wendigo. It wants us to come to it." That's insane. Why would we? Because it's going to keep killing until we do. Because this is its territory, and we're trespassing, and the only way it ends is if we acknowledge that or we make it end. He looked at me. "I know what I'm suggesting. I know how it sounds. But I've been here 17 years, Matthew. I've watched this thing kill dozens of people. I've seen it grow bolder every year. If we don't stop it now, more people will die." "Stop it how?" "We shot it 3 times and it didn't even slow down. Because we didn't know what we were dealing with." He pulled out a battered notebook, different from the one before, older, the cover stained and worn. "This belonged to the ranger before me, Nathan Cross. He spent 30 years studying the Wendigo, obsessed with it. Most people thought he was crazy, but he documented everything, traditional knowledge from the Ojibwe, folklore from loggers, his own observations." He opened the notebook. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, sketches, diagrams, notes in the margins in different colored ink, annotations stacked on annotations. "The Wendigo is a spirit," Ezra read, "but it's bound to a physical form. That form can be destroyed, but only in certain ways. Fire won't work, it's a creature of cold. Bullets won't work unless they're blessed, but iron will. Cold iron, the old stories say. Pure metal, never heated." "Where are we supposed to get cold iron?" Nathan prepared for this. "There's a cache, hidden in the desolation. Iron stakes, spikes, blades, enough to kill it, if we can get close enough." He closed the notebook. "I never thought I'd have the courage to try, but after the other night, we can't wait anymore. It's only going to get worse." I looked at the smoke rising in the distance. Every instinct I had screamed at me to refuse, to find another way, to run. But Ezra was right. How many more Miles and Jacksons would die if we did nothing? "When do we go?" "Tomorrow. At first light. We'll need a clear day. Good visibility. And we'll need to be fast." He handed me the notebook. "Read this tonight. Learn everything you can. If something happens to me, if I don't make it back, you need to know how to finish this." That night, I read Nathan Cross's notebook cover to cover. The early entries were clinical, almost scientific, recording sightings, measurements, behavior patterns. But as the years passed, the entries grew darker. Nathan had lost friends, colleagues, people he'd failed to save. The Wendigo wasn't just an animal to him. It was evil personified, the manifestation of humanity's worst impulses given form and set loose in the world. The final entry was dated 3 days before Nathan's death. He'd had a heart attack, died at his desk in this very cabin. It read, 28 years I've watched it hunt. 28 years of failure. But I understand now. The Wendigo isn't just a monster. It's a test, a mirror held up to humanity, showing us what we become when we surrender to our basest instincts. To kill it, you must resist what it represents. You must choose compassion over consumption, generosity over greed, warmth over cold. You must remember what it means to be human, even when faced with the inhuman. The cache is at the heart of the desolation, in the hollow beneath the Old King, the largest hemlock in the forest. You'll know it when you see it. The iron is there, use it well, and if you fail, at least you'll die knowing you tried to stop the hunger. Dawn came cold and gray. We packed light, just weapons, water, and the map Nathan had drawn. The route he'd marked took us straight into the heart of the desolation, a 6-mile hike through the densest part of the forest. We left at sunrise. The forest was silent as we entered the desolation, the temperature dropping with each step. Frost covered the trees despite the October weather, and our breath steamed in the frigid air. We'd hiked for 2 hours when we found the first bodies. There were 7 of them, scattered through a clearing like broken dolls. All were emaciated, skin tight over bones. All wore expressions of absolute terror. Some were recent, still relatively intact. Others were older, partially skeletal, and one was fresh enough that I recognized the uniform. "Jaden," Ezra whispered. "The ranger who disappeared." We didn't stop to bury them. There wasn't time. The old king revealed itself slowly, growing larger and larger as we approached until it dominated the horizon. It was massive, 20 feet in diameter, rising 300 feet into the air, its crown lost in the canopy above. The bark was scarred with age, marked with symbols I didn't recognize. At its base, partially hidden by roots, was a hollow. Nathan's cache was exactly where he'd said it would be. The wooden box had been there for years, but the contents were pristine. Iron spikes, each about a foot long and wickedly sharp. Iron blades, edges honed to razor sharpness. And a single wooden stake with an iron core carved with symbols that might have been words or might have been prayers. We took what we could carry. The iron was heavy, far heavier than regular steel. It seemed to pull at us, wanting to return to the earth. "Now what?" I asked. "Now we wait. It knows we're here. It'll come." We didn't have to wait long. The temperature plummeted. The frost on the trees thickened, ice crystals growing with visible speed. And from the darkness between the ancient trees, it emerged. The Wendigo was even more horrible in daylight. Every detail was visible, the translucent skin, the bones pressing through from within, the antlers massive and terrible. It moved with that terrible cracking sound, each step an agony to watch. But what struck me most were its eyes. They weren't animal eyes. They held intelligence, awareness, and beneath that something that might once have been human. It stopped 50 feet away, regarding us. When it spoke, its voice was like winter wind through dead trees, somehow forming words. "Flee or feed." "Nathan sent us," Ezra called back. "We know what you are. We know how to stop you." The Wendigo's mouth split wider, impossibly wide, revealing rows of teeth like broken glass. Was it smiling? "Many have tried. All have fed the hunger. Then we'll be the first to succeed." It came for us in a burst of speed that shouldn't have been possible. One moment it was standing still. The next it was nearly on top of us, claws reaching, that terrible mouth gaping. Ezra swung the iron blade, caught it across the chest. The Wendigo shrieked, a sound that made blood run from my ears. Where the iron touched, its flesh blackened and smoked. It recoiled, staggering back. "It works," Ezra shouted. "The iron works." But the wound was already healing, flesh knitting back together with horrible speed. We'd heard it, but not enough, not nearly enough. It circled us, moving between the trees with fluid grace, testing, probing, looking for weakness. I grabbed an iron spike, hefted it like a spear. When the Wendigo darted in again, I threw. The spike struck it in the shoulder, punched clean through. It shrieked again, clawing at the iron, unable to dislodge it. "The heart," Ezra yelled. "Nathan's notes said it has to be the heart." The Wendigo was enraged now, attacking with abandon. Its claws raked across Ezra's arm, tearing through his jacket and into flesh. He fell back, blood streaming. I swung another blade, caught the creature across its legs. It stumbled, went down on one knee. This was our chance, maybe our only chance. I grabbed the wooden stake with the iron core, Nathan's final weapon. The carvings on it seemed to glow, or maybe that was just my imagination. The Wendigo looked up at me, and for a moment I saw something in its eyes that might have been fear, or relief. "Finish it," Ezra gasped. "End the hunger." I drove the stake into its chest with both hands, pushing with all my strength. The Wendigo's mouth opened wide, but no sound came out. The cold intensified to unbearable levels, and for a moment I was somewhere else, a winter night centuries ago, a desperate man making a terrible choice, the taste of human flesh and the horror of what he'd become. Then the stake punched through its heart, and the Wendigo exploded into frost. The cold vanished instantly. The ice on the trees melted, running in streams, and where the Wendigo had been there was only a pile of bones, human bones, ancient and yellowed with age. The antlers clattered to the ground, suddenly just dead bone, nothing more. We stood in silence, breathing hard. It was over. It was actually over. "Is it dead?" I asked. Ezra looked at the bones, then at the forest around us. Already it felt different, warmer. The oppressive silence was lifting. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a bird sing. "I think so. I think it's finally done." We made it back to the station by evening. The dogmen's tracks were still visible, but there was no sign of the pack itself. Without the Wendigo to lead them, they'd probably retreated deeper into the forest. They were dangerous, yes, but they were animals. Dangerous animals could be managed. Ancient evil? That was different. The next morning, a maintenance crew arrived. Ezra had hiked out at first light, made it to a ranger station 20 miles south, called in reinforcements. They brought new trucks, new equipment, new personnel, and new questions. We told them about the bear attack, about the structural damage to the cabin, about everything except the truth, because who would believe the truth? Ezra retired 2 weeks later. He said he'd had enough, that he'd earned his rest. Thomas didn't argue. I stayed, training the new rangers, teaching them the unofficial rules, where not to go, what sounds to ignore, when to trust your instincts and retreat. The desolation was officially closed to all access, permanent barriers erected. The official reason was unstable terrain, but I made sure every ranger knew the real reason. Some of them thought I was crazy. Some of them believed. All of them followed the rules. I'm still here, 3 years later. Station 47, Hiawatha National Forest. Some nights I still hear howling in the distance. The dogmen hunting. But the cold is gone. The hunger is gone. The Wendigo died that day in the forest, and it took its winter with it. Sometimes I dream about it. About those yellow eyes filled with intelligence and agony. About the voice like winter wind, offering me a choice, flee or feed. In the dreams I understand something Nathan had understood. The Wendigo was human once. Just a man, driven by desperation to do the unthinkable. And in doing so, he became something that could never be human again. A warning, a reminder of what happens when we let hunger, any hunger, consume us. The bones are still out there, beneath the old king. I visit them once a year, usually in autumn when the leaves turn. Just to make sure, just to remember. The forest has its monsters. Maybe it always will. But we beat the worst of them. And sometimes on clear days when the wind is right, I think the forest remembers too. The trees stand a little taller. The sun shines a little brighter. We drove out the hunger. We ended the endless winter. And that has to be enough. They say the wilderness doesn't care about us, that nature is indifferent to human survival. Maybe that's true for most forests. But there are places where something older than trees watches from the shadows. Places where the old stories aren't just stories. Places where rangers learn to trust their fear, because fear is the thing that keeps you alive. Station 47 is still operational. The Hiawatha National Forest is still open with restrictions. And somewhere in those 750,000 acres, in the deep places where the sun never quite reaches, things that shouldn't exist still walk between the trees. I know, I've seen them. My name is Matthew. I'm a park ranger. And this is what they don't tell you in the training manual. The forest remembers. And so do I. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that someone believes what I'm about to tell you. 23 years. I've worn this forest green uniform, walked these trails until my boots wore through, memorized every creek bed and ridgeline in the Monongahela National Forest. 23 years of thinking I understood these woods. I was wrong. It started last October, the 17th to be exact. The leaves had turned brilliant orange and gold, carpeting the forest floor in a way that made hikers stop and take pictures every few feet. I was stationed at the Spruce Knob Ranger Station, the highest point in West Virginia. Most days were routine, checking permits, maintaining trails, occasionally rescuing lost hikers who thought their phone's GPS would work in the deep hollows. That morning, I found Matthew Brennan's campsite. Matthew was a wildlife photographer from Richmond who'd registered for a 5-day backcountry permit. He was 3 days overdue. His tent stood perfectly erected near Seneca Creek. Sleeping bags still rolled out inside. Camera equipment worth thousands sitting on a folding table. His truck was parked exactly where he'd noted on his permit. Everything looked normal except for one detail that made my skin crawl. The absolute silence. No birds, no squirrels chattering, no insects buzzing. The forest held its breath like it was waiting for something to pass. I called it in, started the standard missing person protocol. While waiting for the search team, I documented the scene. That's when I noticed the tracks. They started about 30 feet from Matthew's tent, circling it in a wide arc. At first glance, they looked like barefoot human prints, but they were wrong. Too long, maybe 14 inches. The toes splayed out unnaturally wide, and there were claw marks at the tips, deep gouges in the soft earth. The stride length bothered me more than the prints themselves. I'm 6'2", and when I tried to match the gait, I had to take ridiculous lunging steps. Whatever made these tracks stood at least 7.5 feet tall. I followed them away from camp, down toward the creek. They led to a small clearing where the earth was torn up like something had been dragged. Dark stains colored the disturbed leaves, blood, though I didn't want to admit it then. The drag marks led into the dense rhododendron thickets that covered the steep hillside. The search team arrived 2 hours later. 6 volunteers, 2 deputies, and Carter Hughes, our head ranger who'd been doing this job since before I was born. Carter took one look at those tracks and pulled me aside. "You ever hear the old-timers talk about things in these mountains?" he asked, voice low enough the volunteers couldn't hear. "Ghost stories," I said. "Campfire tales." He shook his head. "No, son. Real stories. Stories that made the Cherokee avoid certain valleys. Stories that kept the early settlers inside after dark, no matter what they heard outside their cabins." I wanted to laugh, but Carter's expression stopped me. In 2 decades, I'd never seen him rattled. He was rattled now. "We'll search the standard grid," he announced to the team. "But nobody goes into those thickets alone. Groups of 3 minimum, and everyone's back at base before sunset. No exceptions." We found Matthew's camera first, smashed against a tree trunk about a quarter mile from his camp. The memory card was intact. When we reviewed the images back at the station, my blood went cold. The last 50 photos were taken in rapid succession, the timestamp showing 2:47 a.m. They started as typical wildlife shots: a doe at the creek, an owl on a branch. Then the images became blurry, chaotic, the camera's flash firing repeatedly. In one frame between the motion blur and darkness, 2 eyes reflected the flash. They were at least 8 feet off the ground, glowing with that distinctive eyeshine of a predator. But the spacing was wrong for any animal native to West Virginia. They were too far apart, set in what looked like a face that was almost human but stretched and distorted. We never found Matthew's body. 3 nights later, I was alone at the station, filing reports and trying to convince myself those tracks belonged to a bear with deformed paws. Around midnight, something triggered the motion sensors on the north trail. I checked the monitors. Nothing. The sensors triggered again, this time on the east trail, then the south. Whatever was out there was circling the station. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight, stepped onto the porch. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since sunset, and my breath clouded in the beam of light. I swept the flashlight across the tree line, saw nothing but shadows dancing between the trunks. Then I smelled it. Wet dog mixed with rotting meat so strong it made my eyes water. Something moved in my peripheral vision, just outside the flashlight's reach. When I turned, it was gone. But I heard breathing, deep rhythmic breathing, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I backed toward the station door, rifle raised. That's when I saw it properly for the first time. It stood at the edge of the clearing, just inside the tree line. Bipedal, covered in dark fur that looked black in the darkness. Its head was wrong elongated like a wolf's, but sitting on shoulders that were almost human in their broadness. When it moved, it did so with a horrible grace. Part man, part beast, wholly wrong. Our eyes met across the 30 yards of open ground. Intelligence looked back at me, cold and calculating. This wasn't some animal. It knew exactly what it was doing, had been testing our defenses, learning our patterns. The creature opened its mouth, too many teeth arranged in rows like a shark's, and made a sound I'll never forget. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, but something between the two that made primitive parts of my brain scream to run. Instead, I raised my rifle. The movement broke the spell. The thing turned and melted back into the forest, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. Within seconds, even the sound of its passage had faded. I spent the rest of the night barricaded inside the station, rifle across my lap, listening to it circle the building. Sometimes it would scratch at the walls with what sounded like claws. Sometimes it would make that horrible howl scream. Just before dawn, everything went quiet. When the sun came up, I found tracks all around the station. The same elongated prints, but now I could see details I'd missed before. The ball of the foot had paw pads like a dog's, but the heel was distinctly human. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't entirely one thing or the other. I should have requested a transfer after that night. Should have walked away from these mountains and never looked back. But I had to know what was happening in my forest. That decision cost 3 more people their lives. 2 weeks after Matthew Brennan disappeared, we got a call about screaming near the Dolly Sods wilderness. Not normal screaming. The caller, an experienced backpacker named Ezra Chen, described it as like someone being torn apart, but lasting too long to be human. I drove out with 2 other rangers, Thomas McKay and Gabriel Winters. We found Ezra at the Red Creek trailhead, visibly shaken. He led us 3 miles into the wilderness to where he'd heard the screams. The smell hit us first, death and decay so thick it coated the back of your throat. We found the source in a small grove of hemlocks. What was left of 2 hikers, later identified as a couple from Ohio, had been arranged almost ceremonially. Their bodies were torn open, organs removed with surgical precision, the empty cavities filled with stones and pine boughs. Their heads were missing. Gabriel threw up. Thomas called it in while I searched the perimeter. I found tracks, but not the dogman prints from before. These were different, massive, human-like, but with a stride that suggested something close to 8 feet tall. The prints pressed deep into the earth, indicating enormous weight. Near one print, a tuft of reddish-brown hair caught on a thorn bush moved in the breeze. "Bigfoot," Thomas said when he saw the prints. He tried to laugh, but it came out strangled. "Can't be." But we all knew the stories. Every ranger who'd worked these mountains more than a few years had either seen something or knew someone who had. Massive, hair-covered beings spotted at distance. Wood knocks in the night, that distinctive musky smell that had no natural source. This was different from the stories, though. Bigfoot tales were about shy, elusive creatures that avoided humans. Whatever did this wasn't avoiding anyone. We cordoned off the scene, waited for state police. But while we waited, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The arrangement of the bodies, the stones and pine boughs. I'd seen something similar in an old book about Native American folklore. It was a warning, or a territorial marker. That night, back at the station, Carter called me into his office. He pulled out a bottle of whiskey from his desk, poured 2 glasses. His hands shook slightly. "My grandfather was a ranger here," he said. "Back in the 30s, he kept journals that the family never shared with anyone. I think you need to see them." The journals were water-stained and yellowing, filled with cramped handwriting. As I read, my skepticism crumbled. Carter's grandfather had documented dozens of encounters over his 30-year career. Creatures that walked upright but weren't human. Things with glowing eyes that followed rangers on their rounds. Hikers who vanished without a trace, only to have their bodies found weeks later, mutilated in ways that made no sense. One entry from 1937 stood out. The Cherokee were right to avoid these mountains. "There are older things here than we understand. They tolerate us when we're few, but when too many come, when we push too deep into their territory, they push back. We've lost 4 hikers this month. The state says it's bears, but I've seen the tracks. I've smelled that ungodly stench. These aren't bears. They're not anything that modern science recognizes, and I fear they're getting bolder." "Why didn't anyone report this?" I asked Carter. "Report what? That park rangers believe in monsters? How long do you think the park would stay open? How many jobs would be lost?" He drained his glass. "We manage it. Keep people away from the hot spots. Close trails when activity increases. Most of the time it works." "Most of the time?" "Every couple of decades something changes. They get aggressive, territorial, like now. Over the next 3 days, we had 2 more disappearances. A solo hiker named Isaac Morrison vanished from the North Fork Mountain Trail. His pack was found scattered across a half-mile stretch, torn apart with inhuman strength. A Forest Service worker named Dylan Park never made it back from checking trail markers. We found his truck, driver's door ripped off its hinges, seats shredded and covered in that same reddish-brown hair. The state police brought in search dogs, but they refused to track. The handlers had never seen anything like it. The dogs would whimper, tuck their tails, and refuse to leave their handlers' sides. One German Shepherd, a veteran search dog with dozens of successful finds, took one sniff of Dylan's torn seat and howled in terror. On the 4th night, everything changed. I was staying at the Seneca Shadows campground, helping coordinate the search efforts. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of wood knocking. 3 distinct raps, a pause, then 3 more. Classic Bigfoot behavior, according to the researchers I'd desperately been reading. But this was different. The knocks came from multiple directions, like they were communicating. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight, stepped out of my cabin. The campground security lights created pools of yellow illumination with deep shadows between. In those shadows, things moved. They came from 3 directions at once. 2 were massive, hair-covered beings that moved with surprising grace for their size, what the conspiracy theorists would call Sasquatch. But the 3rd made my blood freeze. It walked on legs that bent the wrong way, too thin for its height, with arms that hung past its knees. Its skin looked pale and stretched in the security lights. And its face, God, its face was human but wrong, features sharp and angular, mouth too wide, filled with teeth that belonged in a predator's skull. The Wendigo. I knew it instantly from the old stories. A creature born of cannibalism and winter starvation, forever hungry, forever hunting. They stopped just outside the light, watching me. The 2 Sasquatch flanked the Wendigo like soldiers. This wasn't random, this was coordinated. The Wendigo spoke. Not with words, but somehow its meaning pressed into my mind like frozen needles. Images flashed, the forest before humans, ancient and undisturbed. Then settlers, loggers, miners, trees falling, mountains scarred, rivers poisoned, and finally a warning clear as spoken words: leave, or feed the forest. I understood then, we weren't dealing with random attacks. This was a coalition. Different species that had coexisted in these mountains, long before we arrived, now united against what they saw as an invasion. We can coexist, I said aloud, feeling foolish but desperate. We can find a balance. The Wendigo tilted its head, an almost bird-like gesture that was deeply unsettling on that elongated skull. Then it screamed. Not the howl scream of the dogman, but something that bypassed my ears and went straight to my spine. Every window in the campground shattered, car alarms went off, and in the distance answering calls echoed from the mountains. Dozens of them. They left then, melting back into the forest, but the message was clear. This was just the beginning. The campground evacuation was chaos, families fleeing in the middle of the night, rangers trying to maintain order while hiding our own terror. The official story was a gas leak, potential explosion risk. Nobody questioned it. They were too eager to leave. Within 12 hours, we'd cleared every campground and trail in a 40-mile radius. The state police set up roadblocks. The media was told it was a chemical spill from an old mining operation. Carter and I knew better. We were abandoning the field. Lincoln Walsh, a ranger from the Potomac District, didn't believe in strategic withdrawal. He'd been with the service for 15 years, had a reputation for being fearless, to the point of stupidity. When Carter ordered all personnel to stay out of the closure zone, Lincoln went in anyway. He live-streamed it on his phone, thinking he'd prove we were overreacting. The footage is probably still out there on the internet, though most people assume it's fake. The video starts with Lincoln mocking the evacuation order, hiking up the Seneca Rocks Trail in broad daylight. For the first hour, nothing happens. Then you can hear it. Wood knocks in the distance. Lincoln laughs, says it's just branches falling. The knocks get closer. At the 90-minute mark, something parallels him through the trees. The camera catches glimpses, dark fur, movement too fast to track. Lincoln's breathing gets heavier. He stops joking. "There's something here," he says to the camera. "Multiple somethings." The trail opens into a clearing. In the center, arranged in a perfect circle, are heads. Human heads on wooden stakes, faces twisted in terminal fear. Some are fresh, some are decades old, mummified by the mountain air. Matthew Brennan's is among them, eyes gone, mouth open in an eternal scream. Lincoln runs. The camera shakes wildly, catching fragments of pursuit. Something bipedal crashes through the underbrush behind him, then alongside, then ahead. They're hurting him. The video ends at a cliff overlook. Lincoln turns the camera to his face. He's crying. "They're all around me," he whispers. "God, there's so many. Tell my wife." The camera drops. In the final frames, you can see them emerging from the tree line. Dozens of creatures. Sasquatch. The elongated horror of Wendigo. Dogmen running on all fours and standing upright. And other things. Things that don't match any folklore I know. Lincoln's body was never found. His phone was left on the trail, placed carefully on a rock like a message. The closure zone expanded. The governor called in the National Guard, told them they were looking for eco-terrorists. 3 units went in, 1 came out. Sergeant Anthony Reeves was the sole survivor of his unit. I interviewed him in the hospital where he was being treated for exposure and what the doctors called acute stress disorder. His story matched nothing in the official report. "We made camp near Spruce Knob," he told me, hands shaking as he held a cup of coffee. "First night was quiet. Second night, Private Morrison saw something. Said it looked like a man covered in hair, watching us from a ridge. We laughed it off. Third night, they came for us. Not attacking, just showing themselves. Circles of eyes in the darkness, reflecting our lights. Hundreds of them. The lieutenant ordered us to hold position. Don't fire unless fired upon. Then the fog came. Thick, unnatural fog that rolled down from the mountain like water. In that fog, things moved. Jenkins started screaming. Said something was in his head, showing him things. Thompson opened fire at shadows. And Martinez. Something took Martinez. Pulled him into the fog so fast we only heard him scream once. We ran. Left our equipment, our dignity, everything. But they let us go, one of us. They let one of us go to tell the story. The military pulled back. Scientists were brought in. Cryptozoologists, anthropologists, even some people from agencies that officially don't exist. They set up monitoring equipment at safe distances, used drones to survey the closure zone. What they found challenged everything we thought we knew. Heat signatures of bipedal creatures throughout the mountains. Audio recordings of complex vocalizations that suggested language. Video footage of structures not quite buildings but deliberate constructions that served unknown purposes. Dr. Joshua Chen, one of the researchers, shared his findings with me off the record. "We're not dealing with undiscovered animals," he said. "These are intelligent beings with their own culture, their own society. They've been here far longer than us, and we've been encroaching on their territory for centuries." "So what do we do?" I asked. "We leave them alone, set boundaries, respect their space, or He paused, choosing his words carefully. Or they'll solve the problem their way. The closure zone became permanent. 100 square miles of the Monongahela National Forest off limits to everyone. The official story keeps changing. Toxic waste, unstable mine shafts, endangered species protection. Anything but the truth. But I know the truth, and more importantly, they know we know. Sometimes, on quiet nights at my new posting 3 states away, I think about those mountains, about the ancient things that walk those ridges, that gather in those hollows. They're still there, watching, waiting, making sure we keep our distance. Other rangers have similar stories now, from different forests. The Adirondacks, the Cascades, the Ozarks, places where the old things have decided humanity has pushed far enough. Lines have been drawn, boundaries established, and God help anyone who crosses them. Nathan Cross, a ranger in Oregon, sent me photos last month. Same tracks, same ritualistic arrangements, same message. This is our forest, stay out. The Park Service knows, the government knows, but what can they do? Declare war on things that officially don't exist? Evacuate millions of acres of forest permanently? Tell the truth and watch civilization panic? So we manage it. We redirect hikers, we close trails, we make excuses, and when someone disappears we search in all the wrong places, knowing we'll never find them. But the creatures are getting bolder, the closure zones are expanding, and I wonder how long before they decide that coexistence is no longer an option. I'm writing this down because someone needs to know. When the forests go quiet, when the animals flee, when that smell of wet dog and decay fills the air, don't investigate, don't be a hero, just run. They were here first. They'll be here long after we're gone, and they're tired of sharing. Last week I got a package with no return address. Inside was a single photo, me at my new posting taken from the tree line. The message was clear. They know where I am. They know where we all are. I've put in for early retirement. I'm moving to the city, somewhere with concrete and steel and lights that never go out. Somewhere the old things can't follow, or so I hope. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that howl scream in the distance. Even here, 300 miles from the nearest forest, and I wonder if anywhere is far enough. The ancient pact is broken, the wild things are reclaiming their territory, and we're not the apex predators we thought we were. God help us all when they decide the forests aren't enough. My name is Kanadi Walkingstick, and I am the last ranger of Whispers Creek National Forest. The Cherokee blood that flows through my veins carries 7 generations of forest guardians, each one teaching the next that the woods hold more than trees and wildlife. My grandmother used to say the forest remembers everything, every footstep, every scream, every soul that never found its way home. The morning of September 15th started like any other. I was checking the trail markers near Devil's Backbone Ridge when my radio crackled to life. Kanati, we've got another missing hiker. College student, name's Jessica Chen. Last seen on the Serpent's Path trail yesterday evening. I pressed the talk button, already knowing this wouldn't end well. Copy that, dispatch. Any companions? Negative. Solo hiker. Her car still at the Whispering Pines trailhead. Solo hiker. The worst kind of search and rescue operation in these parts. Whispers Creek has claimed 17 people in the past 3 years, and only 4 of them were ever found. The lucky ones were discovered within the first 24 hours, usually suffering from exposure and telling impossible stories about shadows that walked upright and yellow eyes that followed them through the trees. The unlucky ones. Well, we found pieces, never enough to determine what had happened to them. I secured my gear and headed towards Serpent's Path, the most treacherous trail in the forest. The name wasn't just poetic. The path twisted and turned like a snake's back, leading deep into the heart of the wilderness where cell towers couldn't reach and GPS signals died. The Cherokee had another name for this place. Sunzikers translates roughly to the place where spirits hunt. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It's an occupational hazard for forest rangers. Spend enough time alone in the woods and you develop a sixth sense about being observed. But this felt different, heavier. Like whatever was watching had been doing so for a very long time. The first sign appeared 2 miles in, a tree broken clean in half about 12 feet up. No storm had passed through recently, and the break was too clean, too precise. The Cherokee side of my brain recognized it immediately. A territorial marker. Something big had been here, something that wanted others to know this was its domain. The second sign came at mile marker 3, tracks in the soft earth beside the creek. At first glance they looked human, 5 toes, a heel, an arch. But they were enormous, easily 18 inches long and 6 inches wide. The depth of the impression suggested something that weighed at least 400 pounds. I photographed them with my trail camera, knowing the images would join the others in a file that park management preferred to ignore. Signs 3 through 6 appeared in rapid succession as I pushed deeper into the forest. Massive stones arranged in perfect circles, as if something had been conducting a ceremony. Trees with bark stripped away in precise spirals, 15 feet off the ground. A deer carcass hanging from a branch drained of blood but showing no signs of predation. And most unsettling of all, a pile of human belongings, hiking boots, a water bottle, a fleece jacket arranged in a neat circle around a fire pit that hadn't been used in weeks. The 7th sign was Jessica Chen herself. I found her at mile marker 5, sitting cross-legged beneath a massive oak tree. She was alive, which should have been the best possible news. Instead, my Cherokee instincts screamed danger. Jessica sat perfectly still, her eyes wide open and completely white, as if the pupils and irises had simply vanished. She was breathing, but slowly, mechanically, like someone in the deepest stages of sleep. Jessica. I approached carefully, my hand instinctively moving to the 45 on my hip. Jessica, can you hear me? She turned her head toward me with unnatural precision, like a mechanical doll. When she spoke, her voice carried an echo that seemed to come from deep underground. He's been waiting for you, Kanadi. The tall one with no face. He remembers your bloodline. My grandmother's voice whispered in the back of my mind. When the forest speaks through human tongues, do not listen, do not trust, do not follow. Jessica, we need to get you to a hospital. You've been out here for over 18 hours. I activated my emergency beacon, praying it would reach through the canopy. Can you stand? He showed me things, she continued, her white eyes somehow focusing on me despite having no pupils. The place where the missing people go, the feeding ground, the nursery where he keeps the children. What children, Jessica? The ones who got lost playing hide and seek in 1987, the family that disappeared from their campsite in 1994, the Boy Scouts from 2001. Her voice grew softer, more distant. They're all there, Kanadi, all still alive, still waiting for someone to come find them. A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond the oak tree. Then another. Something massive was moving through the underbrush, circling us with deliberate slowness. I drew my weapon, though I suspected bullets would be useless against whatever was coming. He wants to trade, Jessica whispered. One guardian for all the lost ones, your blood for their freedom. The footsteps stopped. The forest fell into an unnatural silence. No birds, no insects, no wind through the leaves. Even the creek seemed to have stopped flowing. In that impossible quiet, I heard something that made my Cherokee blood run cold. Children laughing and playing, as if from a great distance. Where are they, Jessica? Where does he keep them? She smiled, and her white eyes began to weep tears of black sap. Follow the spiral path, past the boneyard, through the shadow valley, to the place where the earth opens like a mouth. A shadow fell across us, far too large to belong to any tree. I looked up and saw nothing but canopy. Yet the darkness persisted, growing deeper by the second. Jessica's skin began to take on a grayish pallor, and I realized she wasn't breathing anymore. Jessica. I knelt beside her, checking for a pulse, but her wrist was cold as stone. According to my watch, she'd been dead for at least 6 hours, yet she'd been speaking to me just moments before. Park management could explain away a lot of things, but they couldn't explain away conversations with corpses. The shadow lifted as suddenly as it had appeared, and the forest sounds returned in a rush. Birds chirped, insects buzzed, and the creek resumed its gentle murmur. Jessica's eyes had returned to their normal brown color, though she remained lifeless. I called in her location and waited for the recovery team, but my mind was already working on the real problem. 17 missing people, and according to a dead woman, they were all still alive somewhere in these woods, waiting for rescue. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the Kekla, the giant cannibal who stalked the Cherokee in the old days. She said our ancestors learned to track it by following the spiral of broken trees and arranged stones. She said it could speak through the dead and make bargains with the living. She also said that sometimes a guardian would have to walk into the monster's domain to bring the lost ones home. As I waited for backup, I studied my trail map. There was indeed a spiraling pattern of old-growth trees that led deeper into the wilderness, past a section locals called the Boneyard, where hunters often found unusual animal remains. Beyond that lay a valley that never appeared on any official maps, a place where shadows seemed to pool even on the brightest days. The recovery team arrived just before sunset, and we carried Jessica's body out of the forest, but I knew I'd be coming back. The Cherokee in me demanded it. 17 people were depending on someone to find them, and despite every rational instinct screaming at me to transfer to a nice safe fire tower in Montana, I knew that someone had to be me. That night I sat on my cabin porch and prepared for the hunt. I cleaned my grandfather's rifle, the one he'd carried in Korea, and passed down through 3 generations of Cherokee men. I packed traditional supplies alongside modern gear, cornmeal and tobacco for offerings, sage for cleansing, and a piece of black flint my grandmother had given me before she died. For when you meet the thing that shouldn't be, she'd said. Cherokee magic still works if you remember how to use it. As I packed, I tried not to think about the fact that none of the previous 17 searchers had ever returned. I tried not to think about Jessica's white eyes and her impossible conversation. I tried not to think about the children's laughter echoing from somewhere deep in the forest. But mostly, I tried not to think about the thing my grandmother had whispered to me on her deathbed. The Kekla Kudla isn't just hunting people, Kanati. It's collecting them, building something, and when it has enough. She'd died before finishing the sentence, but I'd always known how it ended. When it has enough, it won't need to hide in the forest anymore. I set out before dawn, following the spiral pattern I'd mapped the night before. The forest felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, older, more watchful, as if the trees themselves were ancient sentinels keeping track of every intruder. My flashlight beam seemed smaller than usual, swallowed by shadows that moved independently of any breeze. The first mile passed without incident, following a game trail that wound between massive pines. But as I approached the area where the spiral began in earnest, I started noticing things that hadn't been there on my previous patrols. Fresh scratches on tree bark too high to be made by any normal animal, patches of ground where the earth had been disturbed as if something heavy had been dragged through the undergrowth, and hanging from branches at exactly head height, small bundles of bones and feathers tied with sinew, Cherokee warning signs that someone had been marking territory. My radio had died somewhere around mile 2, which should have been impossible given its range. My GPS showed my location as a fuzzy approximation somewhere northwest of nowhere. Even my mechanical compass seemed confused, its needle spinning slowly as if it couldn't quite decide where magnetic north had gone. The boneyard announced itself long before I saw it. The smell hit me first, not the clean scent of naturally decomposed remains, but something fouler, more organic, like a slaughterhouse that had been left to rot in the summer heat. I tied a bandana around my nose and mouth, more for psychological comfort than any real protection. The clearing opened up suddenly, a perfect circle maybe 50 yards across. The ground was carpeted with bones, not just animal bones but things I couldn't immediately identify. Femurs that were too long, skulls with too many teeth, rib cages that seemed designed for creatures that had never walked the earth. In the center of the clearing stood a massive oak tree, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter, its branches forming an almost perfect canopy overhead. That's where I found the first real evidence of human presence. Carved into the oak's bark about 7 feet up were symbols I recognized from my grandmother's teachings. Cherokee syllabary mixed with older markings, symbols that predated any written language. The carvings were fresh, the sap still bleeding from the cuts. Someone had been here recently, someone who knew the old ways. I photographed the symbols, then took out the piece of black flint my grandmother had given me. Cherokee tradition held that flint could cut through spiritual deceptions, revealing truth where lies had been planted. I scraped a small piece of bark away from beneath the symbols, and was startled to see what looked like names carved underneath. Michael Torres, 2019. Sarah Kim, 2020. The Hendricks family, 2021. All missing persons from my files. A branch snapped behind me, and I spun around to see a figure standing at the edge of the boneyard. For a moment, my heart leaped. Another survivor, someone else who'd found their way to this place. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized the figure wasn't quite right. Too tall, maybe 7.5 feet. Too thin, as if someone had stretched a normal person like taffy. And where its face should have been, there was only smooth skin, blank as a mannequin. The creature, I couldn't think of it as human anymore, tilted its head to one side with a motion that reminded me of a curious dog. When it spoke, the voice seemed to come from somewhere inside my own head. The Guardian arrives. Good. We have been waiting. Where are they? I kept my rifle trained on the center of its mass, though I doubted conventional weapons would have much effect. Where are the missing people? Safe, fed, cared for, they sleep now in the deep places, dreaming dreams we give them. I want to see them. The faceless thing gestured toward the far side of the clearing, where I now noticed a path leading downward between 2 massive boulders. The shadows between the stones seemed darker than they should have been, as if light simply couldn't penetrate whatever lay beyond. Come then, Guardian. See what becomes of the lost? Not until you explain the deal. Jessica said you wanted to trade. Jessica speaks still. Interesting. Death sits lightly on some spirits. The creature moved closer, and I caught a scent like wet earth and copper pennies. Yes, a trade. 1 life freely given for 17 lives freely returned. The Guardian's blood for the freedom of the collected. Why me specifically? Why not any of the other searchers? Because you carry the old blood. Cherokee magic. The spiral path recognizes you, calls to you. Your ancestors knew us, hunted us, drove us into the deep places, but you came looking. I thought about my grandmother's stories, about the warriors who had ventured into the creature's domain to rescue captives. Most of them never returned. The few who did were changed forever, marked by whatever they'd seen in the darkness below. Show me they're alive first, then we'll talk about trades. The creature nodded, a disturbingly human gesture from something that clearly wasn't, and began walking toward the shadowed path. I followed, keeping my rifle ready, and trying to ignore the way the bones crunched under my boots. The path descended more steeply than seemed possible, as if we were walking into the earth itself rather than down a hillside. The walls on either side were smooth stone, too smooth to be natural, carved with more of the symbols I'd seen on the oak tree. Emergency LED lights would have been useless here. The darkness seemed to absorb illumination, making my flashlight beam barely visible beyond a few feet. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the path opened into a vast underground chamber. The ceiling disappeared into blackness overhead, and the space was filled with what looked like enormous spider webs, except the strands were too thick, too organic. Caught in the webs, suspended 10 or 15 feet off the ground, were cocoons. Human-shaped cocoons. Jesus Christ, I whispered. He hears little in these depths. The creature replied. But they dream beautiful dreams. Watch. One of the cocoons nearest to us began to glow with a soft, pulsing light. Through the translucent membrane I could see a human form. A young man, maybe early 20s. His eyes were closed, but his lips were moving as if he were having a conversation with someone. As I watched, he smiled and laughed silently. Michael Torres, I said, recognizing him from a missing person photo. He dreams he is home with his family, celebrating his birthday. They have made him a cake, sung him songs. He is happy, while you slowly digest him, while we keep him safe, fed, preserved. There are worse fates than comfortable dreams. I counted the cocoons, 17, just as Jessica had said. Men, women, children, all suspended in that terrible web, all lost in whatever artificial paradise the creature had created for them. The trade, I said. Explain it. You take their place. Your dreams will be different, darker, but they will be returned to the surface, unharmed, believing they were lost for only a day or two. Your sacrifice saves them. And if I refuse, they remain. Eventually they will become like us, guardians of the deep places, collectors of the lost. It is not so terrible a fate. I thought about the families waiting for these people to come home, parents who hadn't slept in years, wondering what had happened to their children, spouses checking their phones every few minutes, hoping for word, children asking when daddy was coming back. Then I thought about my grandmother's final words about the creature building something, collecting people for some larger purpose. What are you really doing here? What's the end game? The faceless creature was silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, its mental voice carried what might have been sadness. We are the last, the final remnants of something your people helped to destroy. We do not reproduce as you do. We do not age as you do. We simply persist. But persistence requires sustenance, and sustenance requires dreams. You're feeding off their minds. We are preserving them. When the surface world destroys itself, as all worlds eventually do, these dreams will remain. Perfect moments, trapped forever in amber. They will be all that survives of your species. I raised my rifle. Let them go. You would doom them to return to your world of violence and cruelty and eventual death. This is mercy, Guardian. Their choice to make, not yours. The creature moved faster than anything that size should have been able to move. One moment it was 20 feet away, the next it was directly in front of me, its smooth face inches from mine. I felt something probing at the edges of my consciousness, trying to slip inside my thoughts. Sleep, Guardian. Dream of better things. But Cherokee magic runs deeper than most people realize. And my grandmother had taught me more than just stories. I pressed the piece of black flint against the creature's chest and spoke the words she'd made me memorize. Usdai, Enve Hai, Jiviali, El Vetsunsdai, Nenve Hai, El Aduyuktuvi. Little spirit, I command you to leave. Spirit and human are separate. The creature recoiled as if I'd hit it with live electricity. The mental pressure disappeared, and for a moment its smooth face rippled like water, revealing something underneath that I really didn't want to see clearly. Old magic, it hissed. Older than we expected. Let them go, or I'll use more than words. But the creature was already backing away, melting into the shadows between the web strands. Its voice echoed from all around the chamber now, coming from everywhere and nowhere. The trade remains open, Guardian. Return when you understand that mercy sometimes wears the face of imprisonment. The chamber began to shake, dust and small stones falling from the invisible ceiling. The webs holding the cocoons started to sway alarmingly, and I realized the creature was bringing the whole place down around us. I had maybe 30 seconds to make a choice. run for the surface and leave 17 people to their eternal dreams, or try to cut them down and carry them out before the chamber collapsed. My grandmother always said that being Cherokee meant making the hard choices, even when they were impossible. I started climbing toward the nearest cocoon, my knife in one hand and my emergency rope in the other. The creature's laughter followed me up into the web, cold and ancient and completely without humor. 17 lives, Guardian. Can you save them all before the mountain falls? I reached Michael Torres first and started cutting through the membrane of his cocoon. The material was tougher than it looked, more like cartilage than spider silk. As my knife finally penetrated, viscous fluid began pouring out, and Michael's eyes snapped open. He looked directly at me and said, "Tell my mom the birthday cake was perfect." Then he started screaming. Michael Torres screamed for exactly 17 seconds before falling unconscious. I managed to lower him to the chamber floor using my emergency rope, but the delay cost me precious time. The ceiling continued to rain debris, and larger chunks of stone were beginning to fall. I had 16 more people to save, and maybe 10 minutes before the whole place caved in. The Cherokee in me said to cut my losses, grab Michael, and run for the surface. The Ranger in me said 17 people had families who deserved to have them home. And the part of me that remembered my grandmother's stories said that sometimes the only way to win against a Kekla was to do something so crazy it didn't expect it. I started cutting down cocoons as fast as I could, letting them fall to the chamber floor with wet, sickening thuds. Some of the people inside were still dreaming. I could see their eyes moving beneath closed lids, their faces peaceful and content. Others, like Michael, snapped awake the moment their cocoons ruptured, their expressions shifting from bliss to absolute terror in the space of a heartbeat. Sarah Kim, the graduate student who disappeared while researching local folklore. She woke up swinging, trying to fight off invisible attackers until I managed to calm her down enough to explain where we were. The Hendricks family, mother, father, 2 children aged 8 and 12. They woke up together, holding hands even as their dream fluid drained away. And I realized the creature had been letting them share their dreams. For 3 years, they'd been living in a fantasy version of their interrupted camping trip where nothing bad ever happened, and they could stay together forever. By the time I'd cut down 12 of the 17, my arms felt like lead, and the chamber was shaking so violently I could barely stand. The faceless creature's voice echoed from the darkness above, no longer angry but almost sad. You saved them to return to what? Divorce papers? Cancer diagnoses? Car accidents? Economic collapse? The dreams we gave them were better than anything your world offers. That's not your choice to make, I shouted back, sawing through another cocoon membrane. This one contained a Boy Scout from the 2001 disappearance, now a man in his 30s, but preserved exactly as he'd been at age 12. Look at them, Guardian. Look at what you are dragging them back to. I looked. Some of the rescued people were catatonic, staring at nothing with expressions of devastating loss. Others were sobbing uncontrollably as if they'd just learned of the death of everyone they'd ever loved. Michael Torres was curled in a fetal position, whispering, "It's not real, it's not real," over and over again. "They'll heal," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. Will they? Or will they spend the rest of their lives trying to return to the dreams you stole from them? I cut down the 15th person, a middle-aged hiker, who disappeared 6 months ago. She woke up screaming my name, which was impossible since we'd never met, but then she grabbed my arm with desperate strength. "You have to stop cutting them down," she gasped. "It's not what you think. We're not prisoners, we're guards. We're keeping something else locked up." What? But the chamber chose that moment to really start collapsing. A chunk of ceiling the size of a pickup truck crashed down, missing me by inches. The woman was crushed instantly, her final words lost in the roar of falling stone. 2 more cocoons. I could see them hanging just out of reach, swaying in the chaos. The smart thing would have been to gather up the 15 survivors and get them to safety. But I'd come this far, and Cherokee stubbornness runs deep. I started climbing again, using the web strands like rope, trying to reach the last 2 people before everything came down. As I climbed, I realized the woman had been right about one thing. The chamber wasn't just collapsing, it was opening. The falling debris was revealing other passages, other chambers, all of them filled with a blue-white light that hurt to look at directly. And from those passages came sounds. Not the creature's voice, but something else. Something that had been locked away for a very long time and was now stirring. I reached the 16th cocoon and started cutting, but my knife was getting dull and the membrane was thicker here, older. Through the translucent wall I could see an elderly man, maybe 70 years old, but according to my files he disappeared as a 25-year-old hiker in 1995. The creature had been keeping him in dreams for nearly 30 years. As his cocoon ruptured, he opened eyes that held 3 decades of accumulated wisdom and terror. "Boy," he whispered, his voice like autumn leaves, "you've doomed us all." The blue light from the other chambers was getting brighter. And the sounds were getting louder. Not quite human, not quite animal, but definitely alive and definitely angry about being awakened. "What is it?" I shouted over the noise of the collapse. "The reason the Kekla Kudla exists," he said. "The reason it collects dreams. It's not feeding on us, it's using our dreams to keep the barrier strong, to keep the NVI Duyuk Tave sleeping." NVHI Duyuk TV. The spirit demons from the deepest Cherokee legends. The things that existed before the world was made, trapped beneath the earth by the first medicine men and women. My grandmother had told me stories, but I'd always thought they were metaphors. The 17th cocoon was just above me, but it was different from the others, larger, older, and pulsing with its own internal light. As I reached for it, the elderly man grabbed my ankle. "Don't, that one's not human anymore. That one's become something else." But it was too late. My knife had already pierced the membrane, and what poured out wasn't fluid but pure light. Blinding, searing, impossible light that burned away shadows and revealed things that should have stayed hidden. The thing that had been in the 17th cocoon unfurled like a flower made of starfire and screaming wind. It had been human once. I could see the remnants of a human form at its core, but decades of dreams and spirit energy had transformed it into something between guardian and god. "Finally," it said, and its voice was the sound of mountains being born. "Finally, the seals are broken." The blue light from the other chambers erupted outward, and I saw what we'd really accomplished. The Kekla Kudla hadn't been torturing people. It had been using their dreams as fuel to maintain a prison, and I'd just set all the prisoners free. The faceless creature materialized beside me, no longer threatening but almost pleading. "Do you understand now, Guardian? Do you see why we needed them?" Around us, the mountain was splitting open like an overripe fruit. Things that had been locked away since the Cherokee first learned to speak were clawing their way to the surface, eager to reclaim a world they'd been banished from eons ago. "How do we fix this?" I asked. "We cannot. But you can contain them, for a while. Your blood, freely given, your dreams, willingly shared, become what they were, and perhaps the barriers can be rebuilt." I looked down at the 15 people I'd rescued. They were huddled together, staring up at the chaos above them with expressions of dawning horror. They understood now what they'd lost, what they'd been protecting the world from simply by sleeping. The transformed human thing drifted closer, its voice like singing crystal. "Join us, Cherokee Guardian. Join us in the deep places and help us hold back the dark." I thought about my grandmother's stories about the warriors who went into the monster's cave and never came back. I'd always wondered if they'd died or just found something more important than coming home. Now I knew. "Get them out," I told the Kekla Kudla, all 15. "Get them to the surface. Make them forget the worst of this. Let them think they were just lost in the woods for a few days. And you." I pulled out my knife and drew it across my palm, letting Cherokee blood drip onto the chamber floor. The stone hissed where it landed, and the cracks spreading through the ceiling began to slow. "And I stay. Someone has to guard the guards." The faceless creature nodded, something like respect in its posture. "It will not be pleasant dreams, Guardian. Cherokee warriors don't dream of pleasant things." As the creature began herding the survivors toward the surface, I felt the change beginning. My blood was soaking into the stone and the stone was soaking into me. I could feel my consciousness expanding, touching the prison walls that held back things older than civilization. The last thing I saw before the transformation completed was Michael Torres looking back at me from the tunnel entrance. He raised his hand in a small salute, and I realized he understood. They all understood, now. They'd carry the memory of what they'd lost, but they'd also carry the knowledge of why it had been necessary. The mountain sealed itself around me, and I felt my human thoughts beginning to scatter like leaves in an autumn wind. But at the core of my being, the part that would persist through eternity, I held on to one simple truth. Sometimes being a guardian means becoming the thing you're guarding against. Sometimes the monster is the hero of the story. And sometimes the only way to save the world is to disappear into the darkness and make sure the really dangerous things stay asleep. In the depths beneath Whispers Creek National Forest, I joined my voice to the ancient song that keeps the Envuri Duyu Kadiv dreaming. Every day new hikers disappear into these woods. Every day new dreamers are needed to maintain the barriers. And every day I remember my grandmother's final words. When it has enough, it won't need to hide in the forest anymore. We never have enough. We never will. But we keep trying. Because that's what guardians do.